The sun hung like a copper medallion over the Arizona desert, its harsh light turning the landscape into a sea of gold and shadow. In this unforgiving terrain, where only the strongest plants and most resilient creatures survived, a lone rider approached on horseback, his silhouette wavering in the heat. Jackson Ward pulled his hat lower to shield his eyes from the glare and surveyed the endless expanse of desert around him. At 45, his face was weathered by sun and hardship, deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth like dried riverbeds. The Civil War had ended over 20 years ago, but some battles never truly ended for the men who fought them. His hand instinctively moved to the pocket watch in his vest, the cold metal of familiar comfort against his palm. He didn't need to open it to see the image inside his wife Elizabeth's face, frozen in time alongside their young son, both taken by fever while he was fighting someone else's war. A distant movement caught his attention. Something or someone was moving behind a rock formation about 200 yards ahead. Jackson slowed his horse, his hand drifting to the revolver at his hip. Years of war and solitude had taught him caution. The sound of hooves on rocky ground broke the silence, a horse galloping away with urgent purpose. Jackson spurred his mount forward, following the dust trail. Horse thieves were common in these parts, and a man without a horse was as good as dead in the desert. He caught sight of the thief cresting a ridge, a scrawny man with a ragged hat leading Jackson's spare horse. Jackson dismounted, steadying his breathing as he raised his rifle. At this distance, he'd have one chance. The rifle cracked, echoing across the empty landscape. The thief jerked, then tumbled from his saddle. When Jackson approached, rifle still raised, he found the man sprawled on the ground, blood pooling, but not from a bullet wound. An arrow protruded from the man's chest, its distinctive fletching unmistakably Apache. Jackson spun around, rifle raised, scanning the shadows. That's when he saw her. She emerged from behind a boulder bough, still drawn, her dark eyes fixed on him with unflinching intensity. She was Apache, perhaps 30, wearing a leather vest over a simple dress, her black hair tied back from a face that spoke of both beauty and hardship. "He was stealing your horse," she said in perfect English, her voice low and steady. "But he was also following me." Jackson kept his rifle raised. "And you are someone who didn't need your help." She lowered her bow slightly but kept the arrow nocked. "But it seems we have a common enemy." Before Jackson could respond, the dying thief coughed, spitting blood. "Harmon will find you," he gasped, his eyes locked on the woman. "All three of you." The woman's expression hardened at the name. She approached swiftly and retrieved her arrow with a sharp tug that made the thief cry out. Without another word, she disappeared back into the rocks. Jackson stood for a long moment, staring at the space she had occupied. The name Harmon hung in the air like gun smoke, stirring memories he'd spent years trying to bury. He buried the thief as the sun began to set, not out of respect for the dead man, but because leaving bodies to rot was bad form, even in a place as forsaken as this. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling that watchful eyes followed his every move from the surrounding rocks. The ranch Jackson had purchased for $35 looked exactly as expected for the price. A weathered single-story house with a sagging porch, a barn that leaned slightly to the east, a corral with more gaps than rails, and a well that produced just enough water to sustain a man and his horses if he was frugal. It wasn't much, but it was far from everything and everyone, which was precisely what Jackson wanted. He'd been drifting since the war, taking odd jobs as a ranch hand or sometimes as a gun for hire when money got tight. The modest sum he'd saved over the years was just enough to buy this forgotten corner of nowhere. He unsaddled his horse, rubbing the animal down before leading it to the corral. "Well, Senator," he said to the bay gelding, "this is home now. Try not to look too disappointed." The horse snorted, seeming as unimpressed with their new surroundings as Jackson was. Inside the house was sparse but intact. A table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and a bed frame with a straw mattress comprised the entirety of the furnishings. Jackson placed his saddlebags on the table and extracted a bottle of whiskey, his constant companion since Willow Creek. He didn't bother with a glass, taking a long pull directly from the bottle. The familiar burn traced a path down his throat, momentarily chasing away the chill that had nothing to do with the desert night and everything to do with memories that never faded. As darkness fell, Jackson lit a lamp and examined his new property by its flickering light. The previous owner had left in a hurry, judging by the half-empty cup of now-dried coffee on the table and the abandoned shirt hanging from a nail. What could make a man abandon his home so quickly? The question lingered as Jackson prepared for the night, checking his weapons more out of habit than necessity. Sleep came reluctantly, as it always did. When it finally claimed him, he dreamed of Willow Creek, of screaming women and children, of Captain Robert Harmon, shouting orders over the gunfire of his own voice, protesting commands that no human being should ever obey. But tonight the dream changed. The burning cabins of Willow Creek transformed into an Apache village, and standing amidst the flames was an elderly Apache man, his weathered face dignified despite the horror around him. "Water will wash away your sins," the old man said in perfect English, his dark eyes boring into Jackson's soul. Jackson jolted awake, his hand already on his revolver. Moonlight streamed through the window, casting silver shadows across the floor. He was certain he'd heard something, a footstep perhaps, or the soft rustle of clothing. Rising silently, he moved to the window and peered out. The moonlit yard appeared empty, but fresh footprints in the dust told a different story. Someone had been watching him, likely the Apache woman from earlier. Sleep eluded him for the remainder of the night. As dawn broke, Jackson began the work of repairing his neglected property, starting with the broken sections of fence. The physical labor helped quiet his mind, pushing away both the dream and the memory of those watchful eyes. By midday, the Arizona heat had become oppressive. Jackson paused to wipe sweat from his brow, his shirt clinging to his back. That's when he heard it, 3 rapid gunshots in the distance, followed by the echo of laughter. Most men would have ignored it. In these parts, trouble found those who went looking for it. But Jackson wasn't most men, and something about those shots, their rhythm, their purpose, spoke of cruelty rather than necessity. He retrieved his rifle and mounted Senator, riding toward the sound. The shots had come from the direction of a ridge about a mile north of his property. As he approached, he heard men's voices carried on the wind, punctuated by coarse laughter. Jackson dismounted and proceeded on foot, moving with the careful silence he'd perfected during the war. Cresting the ridge, he looked down into a small canyon and froze at the sight before him. 3 Apache women hung from a weathered wooden beam stretched between 2 Joshua trees. Their hands were bound behind their backs, and they stood on overturned buckets that seemed deliberately placed to prolong their suffering. One had already collapsed, the rope taut around her neck. The other 2 struggled to maintain their balance. 3 men circled them like coyotes around wounded prey. One, a heavy-set man with a drooping mustache, prodded at the youngest woman, with the barrel of his rifle causing her to wobble precariously. "Tell us where the map is, and maybe we'll let you breathe a little longer," he taunted. Jackson recognized one of the women immediately, the archer from the day before. Her eyes blazed with defiance despite her precarious position. The second woman was slightly younger, her expression calm, even in the face of death. The third and youngest, barely more than a girl, had already lost consciousness, her body swinging gently. Without conscious thought, Jackson raised his rifle and fired. The heavy-set man dropped, clutching his shoulder. The other 2 spun around, guns drawn, but faced with Jackson's steady aim and their companions' cries, they quickly dragged the wounded man to their horses and fled. Jackson rushed forward, cutting down the unconscious girl first. She was light in his arms, her pulse faint but present. He laid her gently on the ground before freeing the others. The archer collapsed to her knees, gasping for breath, while the calm-faced woman immediately went to the youngest, checking her pulse with practiced movements. "She's alive," she announced, her voice hoarse from the rope. "But barely." The archer looked up at Jackson, recognition and suspicion warring in her expression. "Why did you help us? What do you want?" Jackson holstered his pistol. I don't want anything. I heard shots and came to investigate. No white man helps Apache without wanting something in return, she insisted, rubbing her raw wrists. I'm not most white men, Jackson replied simply. He knelt beside the unconscious girl. We need to get her somewhere safe. My ranch is about a mile south of here. The archer exchanged a glance with the other woman, some unspoken communication passing between them. Finally, she nodded. I am Takala, she said, the admission clearly costing her. This is my sister Kimmy, and the young one is our sister Diani. Jackson Ward, he replied, gathering Diani in his arms. Let's go before those men decide to return with reinforcements. By sunset, the three sisters were settled in Jackson's sparse home. Diani lay on his bed, still unconscious but breathing steadily. Kimmy had examined her with gentle, knowing hands, applying a poultice of herbs she'd gathered near the house to the angry red marks on all their necks. Takala paced the small room like a caged wolf, her dark eyes constantly moving between her sisters and the windows. When Jackson offered her water, she accepted it warily, watching him over the rim of the cup as if expecting poison. Those men, Jackson said, breaking the tense silence. They mentioned a map. Takala's expression hardened. It is not your concern. It is if they come looking for it here, Jackson countered. I need to know what I'm risking by helping you. Kimmy looked up from tending to Diani. He saved our lives, Takala. He deserves to know. Takala's jaw tightened, but after a long moment she gave a curt nod. Our father was Chief Maka of the Desert Springs Band. This land has been in our care for generations. This is Apache land, Jackson asked, looking around with new perspective. All land is Apache land, Takala replied sharply. But yes, this particular place was our home. Beneath the earth runs a network of underground springs, water pure and plentiful enough to sustain many people, even in the driest seasons. Our father kept this location secret. Kimmy added, her voice softer than her sister's. Water in the desert is more precious than gold. But secrets don't stay buried, Takala continued bitterly. A man named Robert Harmon learned of the water. He came with soldiers and guns. They shot the elders, burned our homes, and poisoned the visible wells to drive us away. Jackson felt his blood run cold at the name. Robert Harmon, the same man from his nightmares from Willow Creek. It couldn't be coincidence. When was this? He asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. 3 summers ago, Kimmy answered. Most of our people scattered or were killed. We survived because our father had sent us away before the attack, sensing the danger. Before he died, our father divided a map to the main spring into 3 parts, Takala explained. Each of us memorized our section and destroyed the physical piece. Only together can we locate the main source. And Harmon wants this map, Jackson concluded. Takala's eyes flashed. Harmon wants to control the water to own what cannot be owned. With it, he would rule this entire territory. Jackson turned away, moving to the window to hide the turmoil on his face. Captain, now apparently Mr. Robert Harmon, the man who had ordered the massacre at Willow Creek during the war, justifying it as necessary to root out Confederate sympathizers. Jackson had witnessed women and children gunned down, had refused to fire upon civilians, had tried to stop it, and had failed. And now Harmon was here employing the same tactics against the Apache. The coincidence was too great, the pattern too familiar. These men who tried to hang you, Jackson said carefully, they work for Harmon. Hired guns, Takala spat, too cowardly to do his dirty work himself. A soft moan from the bed drew their attention. Diani was stirring, her eyelids fluttering. Kimmy hurried to her side, murmuring soft words in Apache. The young woman's eyes opened wide with fear until she recognized her sisters. Then she began to weep silently, her slight frame shaking with the force of her sobs. Kimmy gathered her close, rocking her gently. You're safe, little one. You're safe now. Jackson felt like an intruder on their grief. He slipped outside the cool night air, a relief after the emotional intensity of the room. The stars sprawled across the vast sky, indifferent to human suffering below. He took out his pocket watch, thumbing open the catch to reveal Elizabeth's face in the moonlight. What would she think of him now? A broken man living on stolen land, harboring three women who were rightfully its owners. Would she recognize the idealistic young man she had married in the hollow shell he had become? The door creaked behind him. Takala stepped onto the porch, her footsteps nearly silent. "Your wife?" she asked, nodding toward the watch. Jackson snapped it closed. "She died during the war." Takala was quiet for a moment. "The war between the whites?" "Yes." "Did you fight?" "I did." "Did you kill?" Jackson looked at her directly. "Yes." Takala studied him, her expression unreadable in the moonlight. "Yet you saved us today." Why? How could he explain the weight of regret he carried, the need to atone for sins that could never truly be washed clean? "Because it was right," he said simply. She seemed to accept this, though skepticism still shadowed her features. "You should know the men who ran today will return, and they will bring others." "I figured as much." "This is not your fight," Jackson warned. He looked out at the darkened desert, thinking of the dream of the old Apache man, likely Chief Mucka, telling him water would wash away his sins. "Maybe it is," he replied quietly. "Maybe it has been all along." Morning brought a new clarity to the situation. Jackson rose before dawn, checking the perimeter of the property before the sisters awoke. He found fresh tracks near the western fence line that at least two men on horseback had been watching the house during the night. Inside, he found Kimmy preparing a simple breakfast from his meager supplies. Diani sat wrapped in a blanket by the stove, her young face hollow with exhaustion. Takala was nowhere to be seen. "Your sister?" Jackson asked, setting his rifle by the door. "Scouting," Kimmy replied, stirring a pot of cornmeal mush. "She doesn't trust easily." "Wise policy in these parts," Jackson commented, pouring himself coffee. Diani watched him with large, solemn eyes. She hadn't spoken a word since regaining consciousness, and Jackson wondered what horrors she had witnessed to render her so silent. "We're being watched," he said quietly to Kimmy, two riders keeping their distance for now. Kimmy nodded, unsurprised. "Harmon's men rarely travel alone." "How many does he usually employ?" 10, perhaps 15, she answered. "Men without conscience who will do anything for money." Jackson considered this. Not impossible odds, but not favorable either, especially with three women to protect. "We should leave," he suggested. "Head to the nearest town with a proper sheriff." Kimmy shook her head. "Harmon owns most of the law in this territory. We tried seeking help before. It did not end well." Before Jackson could press for details, the door opened and Takala entered, her bow slung across her back. "4 men watching from the ridge," she reported tersely, "2 more by the creek bed." "They're surrounding us," Jackson concluded. "But yet," Takala corrected, "they're watching, waiting for someone." A chill ran down Jackson's spine. "Harmon." Takala nodded, her expression grim. "He rarely dirties his hands, but for this, for the water, he might come himself." Jackson paced the small room, mind racing through options. "We need supplies if we're going to withstand a siege. Ammunition, food, medicine." "There's a trading post about 10 miles east," Kimmy suggested. "Small run by an old Navajo man. Harmon's influence doesn't reach there." "It's risky to split up," Jackson said, glancing at Diani's fragile form. "More risky to starve," Takala countered. "I will go with you. Kimmy can protect Diani if needed." Jackson raised an eyebrow, surprised by her offer. "You trust me enough to ride together?" Takala's smile was sharp as a knife. "I trust my aim if you prove untrustworthy." Despite the threat, Jackson found himself respecting her fierce protectiveness. They prepared to leave Jackson, providing Kimmy with his spare revolver and instructions on how to use it. As they mounted their horses, Takala on Jackson's spare mount, Diani suddenly spoke, her voice so soft they nearly missed it. "He won't stop," she whispered, eyes fixed on some distant point. "Not until he has what he wants." Jackson and Takala exchanged a glance, both unsettled by the hollow certainty in the young woman's voice. "We'll stop him," Takala assured her sister. "I promise." As they rode east, keeping to draws and washes to avoid being spotted by Harmon's watchers, Jackson couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Diane's words echoed in his mind, along with the dream of Chief Maka. "Your father," he said abruptly, breaking the silence between them. "Did he speak English?" Takala gave him a sharp look. "Yes, he was educated at a mission school as a boy. Why do you ask?" Jackson hesitated, unsure how to explain his dream without sounding mad. "Just curious," he said finally. They reached the trading post by mid-morning, a low adobe building nestled against a rocky outcrop. An old Navajo man sat outside working a piece of silver with gnarled hands. He nodded to Takala with clear recognition, but showed no surprise at seeing her with a white man. "Hostine Begay." Takala greeted him respectfully. "Little Wolf," the old man replied in English, using what must have been a translation of her name. "I see you brought a new friend." "An ally," Takala corrected carefully. "We need supplies." The old man's eyes, sharp despite his age, assessed Jackson thoroughly. "Harmon's men were here yesterday," he said at last, "asking questions about 3 Apache women." Takala tensed. "What did you tell them?" "That I had seen no one," Hosteen replied with a small smile. "My eyes are old after all." Inside the trading post, they quickly gathered what they needed: ammunition, flour, dried meat, coffee, and medical supplies. Jackson paid with most of his remaining money, mentally calculating how long they could last under siege. As they were preparing to leave, Hosteen pulled Takala aside, speaking in rapid Navajo. Jackson couldn't understand the words, but the grave expression on both their faces told him enough. "What is it?" he asked when Takala rejoined him. "Trouble," she said tersely, mounting her horse. "We need to hurry back." They rode hard, taking a more direct route despite the risk of being spotted. Takala's usual stoicism had given way to barely contained urgency. "Hosteen said a man came asking about the ranch," she explained as they rode. "A white man with a scarred face and a cavalry officer's bearing." "Harmon," Jackson growled, spurring his horse faster. "He knows we're there," Takala confirmed, "and he's bringing more men." They were within sight of the ranch when they heard the first gunshot. Smoke rose from the direction of the barn, black against the clear blue sky. Jackson drew his rifle. "Stay behind me," he ordered, but Takala had already knocked an arrow to her bow, her face set in lines of cold fury. They approached cautiously, using a stand of mesquite for cover. The scene before them made Jackson's blood boil. The barn was burning, and 3 riders were circling the house, firing randomly at the windows. There was no sign of Kimmy or Diane. "On my signal," Jackson murmured, aiming his rifle. Takala shook her head. "No, on mine." She loosed an arrow with deadly accuracy, striking one rider in the shoulder. As he fell screaming, Jackson fired, hitting a second man in the leg. The third rider wheeled his horse around, spotting them in the mesquite. He raised his rifle, but before he could fire a shot, rang out from the house, catching him in the side. The wounded men struggled to their horses and fled, leaving their fallen companion behind. As the dust settled, the front door of the house opened cautiously. Kimmy emerged, Jackson's revolver steady in her hand. Behind her, Diane watched with wide, fearful eyes. "Are you hurt?" Takala called, rushing forward. Kimmy shook her head. "They were only trying to scare us. They said—" She hesitated, glancing at Jackson. "They said their boss would be coming soon to discuss terms." Jackson surveyed the damage. The barn was a loss, but the fire hadn't spread to the house. The real danger lay in what was coming next. "These weren't Harmon's regular men," Takala said, examining the fallen rider who had died from Kimmy's shot. "Just local troublemakers hired to soften us up." "Then the real threat is still coming," Jackson concluded grimly. They worked quickly to prepare for the inevitable confrontation, moving supplies into the house, boarding up vulnerable windows, creating defensive positions. All the while, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled toward a reckoning that had been long in coming. As dusk approached, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. He rode a magnificent black stallion and wore a black coat despite the heat. Even at a distance, there was an authority to his bearing that marked him as a man accustomed to command. Jackson watched through his rifle scope, his finger tense on the trigger. After all these years, there was Robert Harmon, older, grayer, but unmistakable. The same man who had ordered the slaughter of innocents at Willow Creek, who had tainted Jackson's soul with the guilt of association. "That's him, isn't it?" Takala asked quietly, coming to stand beside him at the window. Jackson nodded, unable to speak past the knot of hatred in his throat. "You know him." She observed her tone, making it a statement rather than a question. Jackson lowered the rifle slowly. "Yes," he admitted, "from the war." Takala's eyes narrowed. "You fought with him." "Under him," Jackson corrected bitterly. "He was my commanding officer." Understanding dawned in Takala's expression, followed quickly by suspicion. "And now, by coincidence, you buy a ranch on our land where he happens to be hunting us." "It's not what you think," Jackson protested. "I had no idea he was here. I didn't even know this was Apache land when I bought it." "Yet here you are," Takala said coldly, "and here he comes." Before Jackson could respond, Harmon had reached the edge of the property. He stopped his horse, making no move to approach further. "Ward," he called, his voice carrying easily in the still evening air. "I know you're in there. Come out and talk like civilized men." Jackson felt three pairs of eyes on him. Takala's suspicious, Kimi's uncertain, Diani's fearful. The moment hung between them, taut as a bowstring. "If I wanted to betray you," he said quietly, "I could have done it long before now." After a long moment, Takala gave a tight nod. "We will watch," she said, the threat clear in her tone. Jackson stepped onto the porch, rifle held casually but ready. The sun was setting behind Harmon, casting his face in shadow while illuminating Jackson in the last golden light of day. "Captain Harmon," Jackson called, "it's been a long time." "Sergeant Ward," Harmon replied, a smile audible in his voice. "What a surprise to find you here of all places." "It's just Mr. now," Jackson corrected. "For both of us, I think." Harmon chuckled. "Indeed. The war is long over, though I hear you've found a new one." He gestured toward the house. "You're harboring fugitives, Ward. 3 Apache women who have stolen something that belongs to me." "Last I checked, people can't be fugitives on their own land," Jackson replied evenly. "And I don't see how a map to water that's been in their family for generations could belong to you." Harmon's posture stiffened slightly. "So they've told you about the map. Interesting." He adjusted his position in the saddle. "Let me be direct, Ward. Those women are the last obstacle to progress in this territory. The railroad is coming through and they're sitting on water that could serve thousands. It's bigger than just them or their traditions." "And you're just a public servant, I suppose?" Jackson asked sarcastically. "I'm a businessman who recognizes opportunity," Harmon replied smoothly. "The same opportunity I'm offering you now. Turn them over to me along with whatever information they have given you about the map, and I'll pay you $500, enough to buy a real ranch, not this." He waved dismissively, "this shack." "And if I refuse," Harmon's voice hardened, "then I'll take them anyway and you'll die for nothing. I have 15 men camped just over that ridge, Ward. Men who follow orders without the moral qualms that always made you such a disappointment as a soldier." Jackson felt rather than saw Takala move into position at the window, her bow ready. Kimi had taken up his spare rifle covering the back of the house. Even Diani had armed herself with a kitchen knife, her young face set with determination. "You have until dawn to make your decision," Harmon continued, turning his horse. "For old time's sake, I'll give you that much." As he rode away, Jackson remained on the porch watching until Harmon's silhouette disappeared into the gathering darkness. Only then did he allow his shoulders to slump, the weight of the past and the precariousness of the present crashing down upon him. Inside, the sisters waited in tense silence. "You fought for him," Takala accused, her bow still half raised. In the white man's war. Under him, not for him, Jackson corrected wearily, and I came to regret it deeply. Why? Kimmy asked, her voice gentler than her sister's. Jackson sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. The story he had kept buried for so long now demanded to be told. Toward the end of the war, we were stationed in Tennessee. Harmon received intelligence that a small farming community was harboring Confederate guerrillas. He stared at his hands, seeing them covered in blood that had never truly washed away. We surrounded the village at dawn. Willow Creek, it was called. Harmon ordered us to make an example of them, to leave no witnesses. The room was silent, save for the crackling of the fire in the stove. There were no guerrillas. Jackson continued, his voice hollow. Just farmers, women, children. When I realized what was happening, I tried to stop it. I managed to save a few to hide them in a root cellar, but the rest— He looked up, meeting Takala's eyes directly. Harmon did to your people exactly what he did at Willow Creek. It's his pattern, his way. And you, Takala demanded, what did you do during this massacre? I refused to fire on civilians, Jackson said quietly. I turned my rifle on my own men to stop them. For that, Harmon had me arrested, court-martialed. But the war ended before my trial, and the army was eager to bury its crimes. I was discharged quietly, and Harmon— He laughed bitterly. Harmon was commended for his decisive action against enemy combatants. Diane spoke suddenly, her voice small but clear. You tried to stop it, like you stopped them from hanging us. Jackson looked at her in surprise. It was the most she had said since her rescue. Not hard enough, he admitted. Not soon enough. A heavy silence fell over the room. Outside, the desert night closed in, stars emerging like scattered diamonds across the black velvet sky. Somewhere in the darkness, Harmon and his men were preparing for the morning's assault. 15 men, Kimmy murmured. Too many. We have until dawn, Takala said determinedly. We can prepare. Jackson shook his head. No, we need to leave now under cover of darkness. They'll be expecting us to either surrender or prepare to fight. They won't expect us to run. Run where? Takala demanded. This territory is Harmon's hunting ground. There is nowhere safe for us. The trading post, Jackson suggested. Hostine Begay might help us, or at least point us toward a place Harmon's influence doesn't reach. Takala began to object, but Kimmy laid a hand on her arm. We should listen, sister. Fighting is not the only form of strength. A knock at the door froze them all. Jackson motioned the sisters back, raising his rifle as he approached cautiously. Who's there? He called. Sheriff Morgan, came the reply. I'm alone and unarmed. Jackson exchanged glances with Takala, who nodded slightly, her bow ready. He opened the door a crack, keeping his body shielded behind it. A tall, weathered man in a dusty black coat stood on the porch, a sheriff's star pinned to his chest. True to his word, his hands were empty and raised slightly to show he carried no weapon. Mr. Ward, he asked, his voice gravelly with age and tobacco. Sheriff, Jackson acknowledged cautiously. It's late for a social call. The sheriff's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. May I come in? What I have to say shouldn't be overheard. After a moment's hesitation, Jackson stepped back, allowing the man to enter while keeping him covered. The sheriff's eyes widened slightly at the sight of the 3 Apache women, but he showed no other reaction. I see the rumors are true, he commented mildly. What rumors would those be? Jackson asked, rifle still raised. That you're harboring the daughters of Chief Maka, Morgan replied, and that Robert Harmon is fixing to start a small war over it come morning. Whose side are you on in this war, Sheriff? Takala demanded. Morgan turned to her, his expression serious. The side of law, ma'am, which is why I'm here. He reached slowly into his coat, freezing when both Jackson and Takala tensed. Easy, I'm just getting something to show you. He withdrew a small leather journal worn and stained. This belonged to an army surgeon named Dr. Thomas Wilson. He was stationed with Harmon's unit during the war. Morgan opened the journal, turning it so they could see the neat handwriting that filled its pages. It details, among other things, the massacre at Willow Creek, Tennessee. Jackson lowered his rifle, slightly stunned. How did you get this? Dr. Wilson settled in this territory after the war, became the town doctor in Copper Springs. When he died last year, he left this in my care with instructions. Morgan's eyes fixed on Jackson. He mentioned you specifically, Sergeant Ward. Said you were the only one who tried to stop it. What does this have to do with now? Takala asked, though her bow had lowered slightly. Everything, Morgan replied gravely. Harmon has been buying up land all over this territory, always water-rich land, always after the original owners mysteriously decide to sell or disappear. I've been building a case against him for years, but nobody who crosses Harmon lives long enough to testify. And now you think we'll help you, Takala concluded skeptically. I think we can help each other, Morgan corrected. You want your land and water protected. I want Harmon brought to justice for multiple murders. Together we might accomplish both. How? Jackson asked, finally lowering his rifle completely. Harmon has 15 armed men waiting to attack at dawn. Morgan smiled thinly. 14, actually. I arrested one in town for drunken brawling. And they won't attack at dawn. He tapped the journal. Because I'm going to show Harmon this tonight and offer him a deal he can't refuse. What kind of deal? Kimmy asked, speaking for the first time since the sheriff's arrival. The kind that buys us time, Morgan explained. I'll tell him I have evidence that could hang him, but I'm willing to look the other way for the right price. Greed is Harmon's weakness. He'll believe I can be bought because that's how his mind works. And while you're negotiating, Jackson prompted, you all slip away, Morgan finished. There's a Navajo settlement about 40 miles north where you can take refuge while I arrange for federal marshals to come from Tucson. With your testimony, Dr. Wilson's journal, and other evidence I've gathered, we can finally put Harmon away. The plan made sense, but Jackson couldn't shake his suspicion. Why help us, Sheriff? What's your stake in this? Morgan's weathered face grew solemn. My wife was part Apache. She died in childbirth along with our son while I was away on duty. I wasn't there to protect them when they needed me most. His eyes met Jackson's with shared understanding. Some sins can never be washed away, Mr. Ward, but maybe they can be balanced by the good we do after. The words echoed those of Chief Macaw in Jackson's dream so closely that a chill ran down his spine. He looked to Takala, whose fierce expression had softened almost imperceptibly. We'll need to move quickly, she said, making her decision. Gather only what we need. As they prepared to leave, Jackson pulled Morgan aside. If this is a trap, he warned quietly, I'll kill you myself. The sheriff nodded, unperturbed. Fair enough, but it's not a trap. He handed Jackson the journal. Keep this safe. If anything happens to me, make sure it reaches the federal marshal in Tucson, a man named Clayton. Within 20 minutes they were ready. They would travel light on horseback using the darkness as cover. Morgan would return to Harmon's camp with his offer of corruption, keeping the men occupied while they slipped away to the north. As they prepared to leave, Diani suddenly froze, her eyes wide with fear. We can't go, she whispered. We must, little one, Kimmy soothed, but the girl shook her head vehemently. He's already here, she insisted, pointing toward the window. Watching, waiting. Jackson moved to the window, cautiously peering out into the darkness. At first he saw nothing, but then a flicker of movement, the gleam of moonlight on metal. She's right, he said grimly. We've got company. Morgan cursed under his breath. Harmon must have gotten suspicious. Sent men to watch the house. How many? Takala asked, joining Jackson at the window. Can't tell, he admitted. At least 3 that I can see. Then we fight, Takala declared, reaching for her bow. No, Jackson said firmly. We need a distraction. He turned to Morgan. Can you create a commotion? Draw their attention while we slip out the back. The sheriff nodded. I can do better than that. I can arrest them for trespassing. They won't go quietly, Jackson warned. Morgan's smile was grim. I'm counting on it. They quickly formulated a plan. Morgan would approach the Watchers openly, using his authority as sheriff to confront them. During the inevitable confrontation, Jackson and the sisters would escape through the back window using a dry creek bed for cover until they reached the ridge. As Morgan prepared to leave, Takala surprised them all by clasping his arm in a warrior's grip. May your aim be true, Sheriff. He nodded solemnly. And yours, Miss Takala. The moment Morgan stepped outside, calling out to the hidden watchers, Jackson ushered the sisters toward the back of the house. They slipped through the window one by one, Kimmy first, then Diani Takala, and finally Jackson. The cool night air enveloped them as they crouched in the shadows, listening to Morgan's voice growing more confrontational. A shot rang out, followed by return fire. Their distraction was working. Now, Jackson whispered, leading them toward the creek bed. They moved silently through the darkness, the sisters with the natural stealth of those raised to hunt and be hunted, Jackson with the practiced caution of a veteran. Behind them, the gunfire continued, a chaotic symphony that covered the soft sounds of their escape. They had almost reached the ridge when disaster struck. A lone rider appeared directly in their path, his silhouette unmistakable against the star-strewn sky. Robert Harmon sat atop his black stallion, a revolver gleaming in his hand. Going somewhere, Ward, he called, his voice colder than the desert night. Jackson raised his rifle, placing himself between Harmon and the sisters. Let us pass, Harmon. It's over. Harmon laughed, the sound brittle in the still air. But it's barely begun. He gestured with his free hand, and suddenly they were surrounded by mounted men emerging from the darkness like ghosts. Your sheriff friend is quite the actor, Harmon continued conversationally. Almost had me convinced with his corruption routine, but then I've always been a suspicious man. Jackson's mind raced. Had Morgan betrayed them after all? Or had Harmon simply outmaneuvered them both? What have you done to him? Takala demanded, her bow drawn and aimed at Harmon's heart. Nothing permanent, Harmon assured her with a cold smile. Yet, his fate, like yours, depends on your cooperation. Jackson felt rather than saw Takala and Kimmy positioning themselves, forming a protective triangle around Diani. They would not be taken without a fight, even against impossible odds. What do you want, Harmon? Jackson asked, playing for time. The same thing I've always wanted, Harmon replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. The map to the main spring. Give it to me, and perhaps I'll be merciful. Like you were at Willow Creek, Jackson challenged, or at Chief Maka's village. Something dangerous flickered in Harmon's eyes. Still clinging to your misplaced morality. Ward, it didn't serve you well during the war, and it won't save you now. Before Jackson could respond, Diani stepped forward. Suddenly, her young face set in lines of determination that made her look eerily like her father from Jackson's dream. I will show you, she said clearly, her voice stronger than they had ever heard it. I will take you to the water. Diani, no, Takala protested, but her sister silenced her with a look of surprising authority. It is time, sister, Diani said firmly. The water calls for justice. Harmon studied the young woman with newfound interest. The youngest knows where it is interesting. He gestured with his revolver. Come here, girl. Jackson made to block her, but Diani touched his arm gently. Trust me, she whispered so softly only he could hear. With no choice but to comply, Jackson watched as Diani walked toward Harmon with measured steps, her head held high despite her youth and the danger surrounding her. Wise decision, Harmon commented, reaching down to pull her onto his horse. The rest of you will follow at a distance. Any attempt at heroics will result in the girl's immediate death. As Harmon turned his horse, Diani seated in front of him, she looked back at her sisters and Jackson. In the moonlight, her expression was serene, almost triumphant. It was the face of someone who knew something her captors did not. The water will wash away all sins, she called to them, echoing the words from Jackson's dream with such precision that he felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. They followed Harmon's party at the prescribed distance, surrounded by armed riders who watched their every move. Jackson's mind worked furiously, trying to devise a plan, a distraction, anything that might give them an advantage. But as they rode through the moonlit desert following Diane's lead toward an unknown destination, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were all being pulled toward a reckoning that had been set in motion long before any of them realized it. Chief Maka's words from the dream echoed in his mind. Water will wash away your sins. He could only hope it wouldn't wash away their lives as well. They rode in tense silence through the moonlit desert, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats punctuating the night. Jackson kept his eyes fixed on Diane, perched stiffly in front of Harmon on his black stallion. Despite her apparent calm, Jackson could sense her fear in the rigid set of her shoulders. Takala rode beside him, her face an impassive mask that barely contained the fury beneath. Kimmy followed closely, watching their captors with the careful assessment of a healer noting weaknesses. She knows what she's doing, Jackson murmured to Takala, keeping his voice low enough that the guards flanking them couldn't hear. She's a child, Takala hissed back, barely 17 summers. A child who survived your village's massacre, Jackson reminded her. Don't underestimate her. Takala's jaw tightened, but she offered no further argument. The moonlight caught the single tear tracking down her cheek before she roughly wiped it away. They traveled northeast deeper into Apache territory. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, transitioning from open desert to a landscape of twisted rock formations and deep arroyos. Twice Diane directed Harmon to change course, guiding them through passages so narrow they had to ride single file. Where is she taking us? Jackson whispered to Kimmy during one such passage. Kimmy's expression revealed nothing. To water, she replied simply. As the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, they approached a box canyon hidden within a maze of towering sandstone cliffs. The entrance was so well concealed that Jackson would have ridden past it without noticing. Harmon raised his hand, signaling the party to halt. Is this it, girl? He demanded, his voice echoing slightly against the stone walls. Diane nodded. The main spring lies within. Harmon studied the canyon entrance suspiciously. Mills, he called to a lean, hawk-faced man who appeared to be his lieutenant. Take 4 men and check for ambush. As Mills and his men disappeared into the canyon, Harmon turned in his saddle to face Jackson and the sisters. If this is a trap, he warned, his voice dangerously soft, I'll put a bullet in each of you myself, starting with the girl. It's no trap, Diane replied with unexpected assurance. But the water must be approached with proper respect. Harmon's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Save your savage superstitions, girl. Water is wati, a resource to be owned and controlled. Mills returned 10 minutes later, looking puzzled. It's clear, sir. No sign of anyone, but... He hesitated. But what? Harmon demanded impatiently. There's a strange arrangement of stones in there, and markings on the walls. Harmon waved this away. Apache nonsense. Move out. They proceeded into the canyon, which widened slightly after the narrow entrance. The walls rose hundreds of feet on either side, streaked with red and orange, that glowed like fire in the early morning light. Ancient petroglyphs covered portions of the stone hunting scene, spiral patterns and symbols Jackson didn't recognize. The strange arrangement Mills had mentioned turned out to be a circular pattern of stones laid out in the center of the canyon floor. Within the circle stood a single perfectly balanced stone pillar about 3 feet high. Harmon dismounted, pulling Diane roughly down with him. Where's the water? He demanded, looking around the apparently dry canyon. There, Diane said, pointing to the stone pillar. Don't play games with me, girl. Harmon growled, his patience clearly waning. It's not a game, Diane insisted, her voice steady despite his threatening tone. The pillar marks the place. The spring lies beneath. Harmon nodded to his men. Dig. 2 men dismounted, retrieving shovels from their packs. As they approached the stone circle, Takala called out sharply, Stop! All eyes turned to her. She sat rigidly in her saddle, her expression one of genuine alarm. That ground is sacred. There are proper ways to approach the water. More superstition. Harmon scoffed, but Jackson noticed how the workers hesitated, eyeing the stone circle warily. "Mr. Harmon," Jackson interjected, sensing an opportunity in their hesitation. "These beliefs have persisted for generations for a reason. Perhaps caution is warranted." Harmon's cold eyes flicked to Jackson. "Still trying to play the noble protector ward. It didn't serve you well at Willow Creek." He turned back to his men. "Dig. Now." Reluctantly, the men stepped into the stone circle and began to remove the smaller rocks surrounding the pillar. As they worked, Jackson scanned their surroundings, counting men and weapons, searching for any advantage. 14 men total, all armed. Harmon himself carried a revolver and what looked like a cavalry saber. Mills's lieutenant had a rifle slung across his back and a pistol at his hip. The odds were overwhelming, yet something about the situation nagged at Jackson. The sister's calm in the face of apparent defeat. Diani's confident assertion that the water calls for justice, and the echo of Chief Maka's words from his dream. "How did you know about this place?" Jackson asked Harmon, stalling for time as the men continued to dig. "The water, I mean." Harmon's smile was cold. "Information is a commodity like any other ward. It can be bought or," his gaze slid to Diani, "extracted." "You tortured our people." Takala accused, her voice tight with rage. "I employed persuasive methods to acquire valuable intelligence," Harmon corrected smoothly. "Business necessities." "The railroad," Jackson realized aloud. "You're planning to sell the water rights to the railroad." Harmon looked almost impressed. "Very good, Ward. The Southern Pacific is pushing a new line through this territory. They need water for their steam engines, for the workers, for the towns that will spring up along the route. Whoever controls the water controls everything." "And the Apache?" Kimmy asked quietly. "What becomes of them in your vision of progress?" Harmon shrugged. "Progress always has casualties." "Surely a military man like Ward has taught you that." A shout from one of the diggers interrupted them. "Mr. Harmon, we've hit something." All attention turned to the circle where the men had removed the pillar and dug about 2 feet into the sandy soil. One of them held up a flat piece of stone, roughly square and etched with peculiar markings. "A cover stone," Diani explained, her voice carrying in the quiet canyon. "The entrance to the spring chamber." Excitement rippled through Harmon's men. At his gesture, they redoubled their efforts, clearing soil from around the stone until they revealed its full dimensions, about 3 feet square. "Lift it," Harmon ordered. 4 men positioned themselves around the stone fingers, finding purchase at the edges. With a collective grunt, they heaved. The stone shifted, then lifted clear, revealing a dark opening beneath. A breath of cool, damp air rose from the hole, the unmistakable scent of water in the desert. Harmon stepped forward eagerly, only to be brought up short by Diani's voice. "Only those who are worthy may approach the sacred water," she warned. "Those with blood on their hands risk the ancestors' judgment." Several of the men exchanged uneasy glances, their superstition momentarily overriding their obedience. Even Mills looked troubled. Harmon's face darkened with anger. "Enough of your primitive nonsense. Mills, take the girl. I'll see to this myself." As Mills grasped Diani's arm, Jackson tensed, preparing to act despite the overwhelming odds. But Kimmy caught his eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Wait," her expression seemed to say. "Not yet." Harmon knelt at the edge of the opening, peering down into the darkness. He struck a match, the small flame revealing a narrow shaft descending into the earth with crude stone steps carved into one side. "Hand me a torch," he commanded, and one of his men quickly prepared one, wrapping an oil-soaked cloth around a sturdy branch. Torch in hand, Harmon began to descend the steps, his movements deliberate in the confined space. "Keep them under guard," he called up to Mills. "I'll signal when I've found the mainspring." As Harmon's torchlight receded down the shaft, an expectant hush fell over the canyon. Jackson glanced at Takala and Kimmy, puzzled by their continued composure in the face of apparent defeat. If Harmon located and claimed the mainspring, all would be lost. Unless Jackson studied Diane more carefully. The young woman stood calmly in Mills's grip, her expression serene as she watched the opening to the shaft. There was something almost anticipatory in her gaze. 5 minutes passed, then 10. The men grew restless, shifting in their saddles, exchanging uncertain looks. Mills, one of them, finally called. "Shouldn't he have found it by now?" Mills frowned at the dark opening. "Harper Wesson," he ordered, "go check on Mr. Harmon." Two men reluctantly approached the shaft, peering down into the darkness. "Mr. Harmon," one called. There was no response. "I don't like this," the other muttered. "Something ain't right." Mill's expression hardened. "Get down there and find him. Now." The men looked at each other nervously, then one struck a match and lit another torch. Together they descended into the earth. More minutes passed. The tension in the canyon grew palpable as the silence from the shaft continued. Mills paced anxiously, his hand resting on his pistol. "What did you do?" he finally demanded of Diane, his voice sharp with fear. She met his gaze steadily. "I did nothing. The water judges." A sudden noise from the shaft startled everyone, a scraping, scrabbling sound, followed by harsh, desperate breathing. One of the men who had gone after Harmon appeared at the opening, his face ashen with terror. He clawed his way out of the shaft and collapsed on the ground, gasping. "Snakes," he choked out between ragged breaths. "Hundreds of them. Harper. They got Harper. And, and, and Harmon," Mills pressed, kneeling beside the shaking man. The man's eyes were wide with horror. "Something took him. Something in the water. It pulled him under." A murmur of superstitious fear rippled through the remaining men. Several made warding gestures, and one actually dropped his rifle to back away from the opening. Mills struggled to maintain control. "Nonsense," he snapped, though his voice lacked conviction. "There's no monster down there. Harper probably fell, and Harmon—" He couldn't complete the thought. "The water judges," Diane repeated softly. Mills rounded on her, drawing his pistol. "What did you do, witch? What's down there?" Before she could answer, a new sound emerged from the shaft, a low, hollow moaning that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth itself. The sound raised the hair on Jackson's neck, and even the most hardened of Harmon's men went pale. "We need to leave," one of them said, backing toward his horse. "Now." "Stand your ground," Mills shouted, but his authority was crumbling. The moaning from the shaft intensified, joined by a sound like rushing water. Suddenly, water erupted from the opening, shooting upward before cascading back down to soak the ground around the circle of stones. The water was dark, almost black, in the early morning light. "Blood," someone whispered in horror. "It's blood." Though Jackson knew it was more likely a mineral-rich water discolored by its journey through the earth, the effect was undeniably unsettling. More of Harmon's men began to edge toward their horses. In the momentary confusion, Diane twisted free from Mills' loosened grip and ran to her sisters. Mills raised his pistol to fire after her, but Jackson was quicker. He threw himself from his horse, tackling Mills to the ground. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the air. The gunshot broke the spell of fear that had held the men paralyzed. Chaos erupted as some rushed to Mills's aid, while others fled, convinced they were witnessing supernatural retribution. Jackson grappled with Mills on the ground, the two men rolling dangerously close to the water-spewing shaft. Mills was younger and stronger, but Jackson fought with the desperation of a man who had nothing left to lose. A well-placed punch sent Mills reeling back, and for a critical moment, Jackson had the advantage. He seized Mills' fallen pistol and fired twice into the air, adding to the confusion. "The Apache spirits are rising," he shouted, playing on the men's obvious superstition. "Run if you want to live." More men broke and fled, their horses galloping toward the canyon entrance. Mills regained his footing and charged at Jackson with a roar of fury, but an arrow from Tequela's bow caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. Three men remained loyal to Mills, returning to help their fallen leader and firing wildly at Jackson and the sisters. Jackson rolled behind a boulder, returning fire with Mills' pistol, while Takala loosed arrows with deadly precision. Above the sounds of gunfire and shouting, the rushing water from the shaft grew louder. The dark liquid was now pooling around the stone circle, spreading outward in an ever-widening stain across the canyon floor. One of Mill's men fell to Takala's arrow, another took a bullet from Jackson and staggered back clutching his leg. The third, seeing the odds turn against them, grabbed Mills and dragged him toward the remaining horses. "This isn't over, Ward," Mills shouted as they retreated. "We'll be back with more men." Within moments, they had mounted and galloped away, leaving Jackson and the sisters alone in the canyon with the mysteriously flowing water. Jackson rose cautiously, checking for other threats before approaching the sisters. "Is everyone all right?" Takala nodded tersely, her bow still half raised as she watched the canyon entrance. Kimmy was examining a shallow cut on Diane's arm, where Mills had gripped her too tightly. "What happened to Harmon?" Jackson asked, turning to look at the shaft which continued to disgorge dark water at an alarming rate. "The water judged him," Diane replied simply. "There are chambers beneath," Kimmy explained more practically, "tunnels that lead to underwater caverns. Some fill completely during the rainy season. If he went too far," Jackson understood, "Harmon could have become disoriented in the darkness, fallen into deeper water, or been trapped by a suddenly flooded passage. Still, the timing seemed almost orchestrated." "You knew this would happen," he said to Diane, realization dawning. "You led him here deliberately." Diane's eyes met his, ancient in her young face. "I had a dream," she said softly. "My father told me the water would cleanse our land of Harmon's evil, that I must lead him to judgment." Jackson shivered despite the growing heat of the day. It was too similar to his own dream of Chief Maka to be coincidence. "We should go," Takala urged, still watching the canyon entrance. "Mills will bring reinforcements." "Where?" Jackson asked. "Back to the ranch." Kimmy shook her head. "Too obvious. They'll look for us there first." "Hostine Begay's trading post," Takala suggested. "It's defendable and he has ways to send messages to other Apache bands." Jackson nodded his agreement, but his gaze was drawn back to the shaft and its endless flow of dark water. "What about," he gestured vaguely. "The spring will settle," Kimi assured him, "and this has happened before when the ancestors are disturbed. The water always finds balance again." They gathered their horses, which had fortunately remained nearby despite the commotion. As they prepared to leave, Jackson noticed Diane kneeling at the edge of the spreading pool, her fingers trailing in the dark water as she whispered words in Apache. "A prayer of gratitude," Kimi explained quietly, "and of apology for using the sacred water as a weapon even against one who deserved judgment." When Diane rose, her young face was composed but solemn. She mounted her horse without assistance, sitting straighter than before, as if some burden had been lifted from her shoulders. They rode hard, taking a circuitous route to avoid being tracked. Jackson's mind churned with questions about what he had witnessed. Was it merely a fortuitous accident that had claimed Harmon, or something more, something that defied his understanding of the world? By midday, they had reached a ridge overlooking a vast expanse of desert. In the distance, a thin plume of smoke marked the location of Hostine Begay's trading post. They paused to rest the horses and take stock of their situation. "What happens now?" Jackson asked, watching as Kimmy tended to Diane's injured arm with herbs from a small pouch she carried. "Mills will gather what remains of Harmon's men," Takala replied grimly. "He'll hunt us if only to avenge his master." "And Sheriff Morgan," Takala's expression darkened. "If he lives, he'll need help. Harmon's men wouldn't have left a witness." Jackson nodded his thoughts, turning to the sheriff and the journal he had entrusted to them, the evidence that might finally bring justice for both Willow Creek and the Apache massacre. "We need to get word to the federal marshal in Tucson," he said, remembering Morgan's instructions. "A man named Clayton." "Hostine can send a runner," Kimmy suggested. "He has connections with tribes that can pass messages faster than any white man's post." As they prepared to continue their journey, a distant sound froze them in place, hoofbeats approaching rapidly from the east. Riders, Takala warned, notching an arrow to her bow. Jackson raised his field glass, scanning the horizon. A group of mounted men appeared, moving fast across the desert floor. But as they drew closer, he realized they weren't Harmon's men. Apache, he said, lowering the glass. About 8 of them. Takala took the glass, studying the approaching riders with increasing surprise. Not just any Apache, she said, her voice tight with emotion. Those are warriors from our band. Men I thought dead in the massacre. Survivors. Kimmy breathed hope, lighting her features for the first time since Jackson had met her. The Apache riders spotted them on the ridge and changed course, approaching cautiously. As they drew near, Jackson could see they were led by a tall, powerfully built man with a face marked by both age and hardship. Takala, Kimmy, and Diani rushed forward as the riders dismounted, exchanging emotional greetings in their native language. There were tears and laughter, hands clasping arms, foreheads touching in a gesture of profound connection. Jackson hung back, acutely aware of his outsider status. After a few minutes, Takala turned and gestured for him to approach. Jackson Ward, she said formally. This is Nihilze, our father's brother and war chief of our band. The tall Apache studied Jackson with piercing eyes that missed nothing. My nieces tell me you saved them from hanging, he said in accented but clear English. I did what anyone would do, Jackson replied. Nihilze's smile was grim. Few white men would risk their lives for Apache women. Why did you, before Jackson could formulate a response, Diani spoke up. He carries the weight of past wrongs, she said quietly. He seeks the water of forgiveness. Nihilze's gaze sharpened with interest. Is this true, Jackson Ward? Jackson hesitated, then nodded. I've done things, seen things I can't undo. Helping your nieces seemed like the right thing to do. The war chief considered this, then extended his hand in the white man's gesture of greeting. Then perhaps the spirits guided you to them for a purpose. As they clasped hands, Jackson felt an unexpected sense of acceptance, not forgiveness exactly, but the possibility of it. The reunion was cut short by the urgent business at hand. Through rapid conversation in Apache, which Kimmy occasionally translated for Jackson's benefit, they learned that Nihilze and his warriors had been tracking Harmon's men for days, waiting for an opportunity to rescue the sisters. We saw riders fleeing from the sacred canyon, Nihilze explained. Then water began to flow down the washed dark water. His expression grew solemn. We knew the spirits had awakened. Harmon is dead, Takala confirmed, judged by the water. A murmur of satisfaction passed through the warriors. Nihilze nodded gravely. But his servant, the thin one with the hawk face, he escaped with some men. Mills, Jackson confirmed. He'll regroup, possibly bring more men. Then we must move quickly, Nihilze decided. Our camp is hidden in the Painted Rocks, 2 hours' ride from here. We will go there first, then send messengers to the other bands and to this federal marshal you speak of. As they prepared to depart, Jackson found himself riding alongside Nihilze, who studied him with thoughtful intensity. My brother visited you in dreams, the war chief said suddenly. It wasn't a question. Jackson stiffened in surprise. How did you know? Diani Guy is not the only one who hears the voices of ancestors, Nihilze replied. Maka was a powerful dreamer in life. In death, his spirit would seek those who could help his daughters. He said water would wash away my sins, Jackson admitted, feeling strangely unburdened by speaking the words aloud. Nihilze nodded as if this confirmed something. The water judges, but it also heals. Harmon faced one aspect of its power. Perhaps you are meant to experience the other. They rode in silence after that, Jackson pondering the war chief's words as they traveled deeper into Apache territory. The Apache camp was well hidden in a labyrinth of towering rock formations, their striated surfaces painted with bands of red, orange, and white. About 20 people, mostly women, children, and elders, had established a temporary home among the protective stones. Their arrival caused a flurry of excitement. The sisters were welcomed with joyful tears, embraced by tribal members who had clearly feared them lost forever. Jackson received curious, sometimes suspicious glances, but Nahilze's obvious acceptance prevented any outright hostility. An elderly woman approached Diani, cupping the girl's face in gnarled hands and examining her with intense scrutiny. After a moment, she nodded in satisfaction and spoke rapid Apache to Nahilze. "Who is she?" Jackson asked Kimmy, who stood nearby. "Liluye, our grandmother," Kimmy explained. "She is a powerful medicine woman. She says Diani carries the mark of the water spirits now that she is changed by her role in Harmon's judgment." Indeed, there was something different about the youngest sister. The fearful, traumatized girl Jackson had first encountered had been replaced by someone more centered, more present. She moved with newfound confidence as she greeted each tribal member. As evening approached, the Apache prepared a meal around a small, carefully shielded fire. Jackson was included in the circle, given a place between Kimmy and a young warrior named Shaitan, who watched him with undisguised curiosity. "You fought in the white man's great war," Shaitan asked suddenly as they ate. Jackson nodded, surprised by the direct question. "Against your own people?" "Against those who wanted to keep others enslaved," Jackson corrected. Shaitan considered this. "Yet after your victory, your people still took our land, killed our families." There was no accusation in his tone, merely a request for understanding. Jackson struggled to find an adequate response. "Not all victories bring justice," he finally said. "And sometimes those who fight for right causes still commit great wrongs. Like you at this place called Willow Creek," Chaitan pressed. Jackson's spoon froze halfway to his mouth. He glanced at Takala, who was engaged in conversation elsewhere, then back at Chaitan. "How do you know about that?" "Diani told us what you said in the house, about the village Harmon destroyed during your war." Jackson set his bowl down, appetite gone. "I didn't stop it," he admitted, the familiar guilt settling over him like a shroud. "I tried, but too late, too feebly." Chaitan studied him thoughtfully. "Yet you tried, when others did not." Before Jackson could respond, Nahilze called for attention. The camp fell silent as the war chief stood, his powerful presence commanding respect. "Tonight we have much to celebrate," he began in Apache, which Kimmy quietly translated for Jackson. "The daughters of Maka have returned to us. The enemy who slaughtered our people has faced the judgment of the sacred waters." Murmurs of approval rippled through the gathering. "But our fight is not finished," Nahilze continued. "Harmon's men still threaten our lands, and there is the matter of justice in the white man's way as well." He looked directly at Jackson. "Our friend brings word of a federal marshal who might help us secure our rightful claim to the springs and protection from those who would take what is ours." Jackson nodded, acutely aware of all eyes upon him. Sheriff Morgan was gathering evidence against Harmon, proof of his crimes both here and elsewhere. "If we can get that evidence to Marshal Clayton in Tucson, there's a chance for justice under white man's law." "Why should we trust white man's law?" an older warrior challenged. "It has never protected Apache before." It was a fair question, one Jackson had no easy answer for. To his surprise, it was Takala who responded. "We must use all weapons available to us," she said firmly. "The sacred water has delivered its judgment on Harmon. Now we must ensure his followers cannot simply take his place." Discussion erupted, some arguing for traditional Apache justice, direct action against Mills and his men, while others supported the plan to seek federal intervention. Throughout the debate, Jackson noticed how the sisters were treated with deference despite their youth, particularly Diani, whom even the elders seemed to regard with newfound respect. Eventually, a consensus was reached. Runners would be sent at first light, one to Tucson, to contact Marshal Clayton, others to allied bands to request support in case Mills gathered enough men to attack. In the meantime, the camp would prepare for possible conflict while remaining hidden. As the gathering dispersed, Jackson found himself drawn to the edge of the camp, where the last light of sunset painted the desert in hues of gold and crimson. The beauty of it struck him anew, this harsh land that somehow nurtured such resilient people. It gets inside you, doesn't it? Takala's voice came from behind him. The desert. Jackson turned to find her standing a few paces away, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. It does, he agreed. There's an honesty to it. It doesn't pretend to be gentle or forgiving, but there's still beauty here. Takala moved to stand beside him, her gaze sweeping over the darkening landscape. My father used to say the desert strips away everything false, that only what is true can survive its touch. Wise man. He was. She was quiet for a moment, then added, he would have understood you, I think. Jackson glanced at her, surprised by the unexpected softness in her voice. What makes you say that? You carry guilt like a second skin, she observed. My father understood that weight. He carried his own for those he couldn't save for choices that brought pain to others. Your sister said the water judges, Jackson said quietly. What if it judges me and finds me wanting? Takala studied him in the fading light. The water does not judge intent, only action. It saw Harmon's soul and found only darkness. I don't think it would see the same in you. How can you be sure? Because, she said simply, a man who carries guilt for his failures is a man who recognizes right from wrong. Harmon felt no guilt, only entitlement. They stood in companionable silence as darkness settled fully over the desert. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called its lonely cry, echoing against the rocks. Tomorrow will bring its own dangers, Takala finally said. You should rest. Jackson nodded but made no move to return to the camp. In a moment. After Takala left, Jackson withdrew his pocket watch, opening it to gaze at Elizabeth's face in the starlight. For the first time in years, he found he could look at her image without the crushing weight of failure pressing down on him. I'm trying to make it right, he whispered to her memory, as much as anyone can. He could almost imagine her response, practical, loving Elizabeth, who had always believed in redemption. Some wrongs can never be undone, Jackson, but that doesn't mean we stop trying to balance them with right. When he finally returned to the camp, he found a place prepared for him near the sisters' shelter, a small gesture of inclusion that moved him more than he could express. He lay down expecting the usual battle with insomnia, but sleep came swiftly and for once without nightmares. Dawn brought activity to the camp as runners prepared to depart on their various missions. Jackson watched as Nahilze gave specific instructions to each, using a mixture of Apache and English that suggested some messages were intended for white authorities. Chatun will go to Tucson, Nahilze explained to Jackson. He speaks good English and can pass in white settlements without drawing too much attention. Jackson nodded, then hesitated. The journal Sheriff Morgan gave us, it contains evidence about Willow Creek. It might help convince the marshal to take action. A wise thought, Nahilze agreed. Where is this journal now? Jackson's heart sank as he realized. In my saddlebag, at the ranch. Tekala, who had joined them, frowned. Wholesome Moles and his men will almost certainly be watching the ranch. Nevertheless, we need that journal, Nahilze insisted. Without it, your word alone may not be enough to move this marshal to action. I'll go, Jackson volunteered immediately. It's my responsibility. Not alone, Takala said firmly. I know the land better than you, and I can spot an ambush before it's sprung. Nahilze considered this, then nodded his approval. Take Takala and 2 warriors. Move carefully. If the ranch is too heavily guarded, return without engaging. The journal is important, but not worth your lives. Preparations were made quickly. Jackson and Takala would be accompanied by Chaitan and another warrior named Hansky, both skilled scouts. They would approach the ranch from the north using a series of arroyos that Takala knew well, which would keep them hidden from any watchers on the ridges. As they prepared to leave, Diani approached Jackson, her young face solemn. Be cautious, she said quietly. The water has judged Harmon, but his shadow still stretches across the land. There was something in her tone that sent a chill down Jackson's spine, the same eerie certainty she had displayed at the sacred spring. "We'll be careful," he promised. Kimmy pressed a small leather pouch into his hand. "Healing herbs," she explained, "just in case." The four riders set out as the sun cleared the eastern horizon, keeping to low ground and moving at a steady pace that balanced speed with stealth. Jackson was impressed by the Apache warrior's ability to read the landscape, noting signs he would have missed entirely, a displaced stone here, a bent twig there, all telling the story of who had passed before them. By mid-morning, they had covered significant ground. They paused in the shelter of a deep arroyo to rest the horses and confer about their approach. "We're about 2 miles from your ranch," Chatan reported, having scouted ahead. "There are tracks, many horses moving in and out. Mills has men there." "How many?" Jackson asked. Chatan shrugged. He shrugged. "Hard to say. The tracks are confused, some old, some new." "We need to get closer," Takala decided. "There's a ridge to the east that overlooks the property. We can observe from there." They proceeded with increased caution, dismounting and leading their horses the final half-mile to minimize their profile. The ridge Takala had mentioned provided an excellent vantage point concealed by a stand of piñon pines. Jackson surveyed his property through his field glass. What he saw made his jaw tighten in anger. The house had been ransacked, doors, hanging open furniture, dragged outside and broken. Four men lounged in the yard, smoking and passing a bottle between them. Two more stood watch on the roof of the barn, which had been partially repaired after the fire. "6 that we can see," he reported, passing the glass to Takala. She studied the scene carefully. "There may be more inside, and these don't move like ordinary hired guns. They're too disciplined." "Soldiers," Jackson suggested. "Former soldiers," Hansky corrected, taking his turn with the glass. "Like coyotes who once ran with wolves, they remember the ways of the pack." Jackson considered this. Ex-military men would be more dangerous than the typical hired gun, more organized, more strategic in their thinking. "We need a distraction," he decided. "Something to draw them away from the house long enough for me to get inside and find the journal." They formulated a plan. Chatan and Hansky would create a distraction to the south of a small fire and gunshots to suggest an Apache attack from that direction. While the men at the ranch responded, Takala would cover Jackson as he slipped into the house to retrieve the journal. "If anything goes wrong," Jackson insisted, "you ride for the camp. Don't wait for me." Takala's expression hardened. "We leave together or not at all." There was no time to argue. As midday approached, Chatan and Hansky circled south to get into position. Jackson and Takala moved closer to the ranch using a dry creek bed that ran within 50 yards of the house. "Ready?" Jackson asked as they crouched in the shallow depression, the sun beating down mercilessly. Takala nodded, checking her bow one last time. "Be swift," she advised. "Take nothing but the journal." They waited tense and silent for the signal. When it came, 3 rapid gunshots followed by the distant glow of fire, the effect was immediate. The men at the ranch scrambled to respond, shouting orders and grabbing weapons. "Apache attack from the South Ridge," someone yelled. "All hands!" 5 of the 6 men they had spotted ran toward the disturbance, leaving only one guard on the roof of the barn. Takala raised her bow, took careful aim, and loosed an arrow. The guard collapsed silently. "Now," she whispered. Jackson sprinted across the open ground to the house, keeping low. He slipped inside through the hanging door, momentarily disoriented by the destruction. His few possessions had been scattered. Furniture, overturned floorboards pried up in places as if the searchers expected to find something hidden beneath. Focus. The journal had been in his saddlebag, which he had left hanging on a peg near the door. The peg was empty now, the floor below it littered with spilled contents. He searched frantically, aware that each passing second increased the danger. The journal wasn't among the scattered items on the floor. He moved deeper into the house, checking under overturned furniture, inside the cast-iron stove, anywhere a small leather-bound book might have been hidden or overlooked. Nothing. A shout from outside warned him that the men had realized the diversion for what it was. Gunfire erupted, the sharp crack of rifles punctuated by the distinctive sound of Takala's bowstring. Jackson was about to abandon the search when a floorboard creaked oddly under his foot. He looked down, noticing that this particular board had already been pried up and roughly replaced. Kneeling, he lifted it and found a small space beneath. There, wrapped in an oilcloth, lay Sheriff Morgan's journal. Relief flooded through him as he tucked it securely inside his shirt. But as he turned to leave, he found his path blocked by a tall figure silhouetted in the doorway. "Looking for something?" Ward Mills asked, his thin face twisted in a cruel smile. Jackson lunged for his pistol, but Mills was faster. The butt of his rifle crashed down, catching Jackson on the temple. Pain exploded through his skull, followed by encroaching darkness. His last conscious thought was of Takala, hoping desperately that she had heeded his instruction to flee if things went wrong. Consciousness returned slowly, bringing with it throbbing pain and the taste of blood. Jackson blinked, trying to focus in dim light. He was inside a building, not his house, but somewhere with stone walls. A cellar, perhaps, or a storage room. His hands were bound behind him, secured to a support post. His ankles were similarly tied. A methodical check of his body revealed no serious injuries beyond the blow to his head, but the journal was gone from inside his shirt. As his vision cleared, he made out a figure seated on a crate a few feet away watching him. Not Mills, but a younger man with a lieutenant's bearing and a face that seemed vaguely familiar. "He's awake, sir," the young man called toward the door. Heavy footsteps approached, and Mills entered the small room, the journal in his hand. "Welcome back, Ward," he said coldly. "I believe you were looking for this." Jackson remained silent, assessing his situation. The stone walls suggested he was in one of the outbuildings at the Harmon Ranch, probably the root cellar beneath the main house. The young officer was likely one of Mills's ex-military men, which meant others were nearby. "Not talkative," Mills prodded. "That's fine. I've been reading some interesting material." He held up the journal. "Quite a tale Dr. Wilson spins about Willow Creek. Harmon wouldn't have been pleased to know this was floating around." "Harmon's dead," Jackson said, his voice rough with thirst. "The water judged him." Mill's expression darkened. "Superstitious nonsense. Mr. Harmon had an accident in those caves, nothing more." "Keep telling yourself that," Jackson replied, unable to resist goading the man despite his precarious position. "I saw his face when the water started to rise. He knew what was happening to him." Mills stepped forward and backhanded Jackson across the face, reopening the cut on his temple. "Mr. Harmon built something here. Created order from chaos. I won't let his work die with him." "His work was murder and theft," Jackson spat, "just like at Willow Creek." "Necessary sacrifices for progress," Mills insisted. "The Apache are relics, Ward. The future belongs to men like Harmon, men with vision." "Men like Harmon are parasites," Jackson countered. "They don't build. They take what others have built and claim it as their own." Mills studied him with cold contempt. "I expected better from a former soldier. You used to understand how the world works." "I understood too late," Jackson admitted, "but I'm making up for it now." A humorless smile crossed Mills's face. "No, you're not. You're going to die here, Ward. But first you are going to tell me where to find those Apache women and their uncle's camp." Jackson laughed despite the pain it caused. "You think I'd tell you that?" "Eventually," Mills replied with chilling confidence. "Everyone talks given the right persuasion." He nodded to the young officer, who produced a leather case from beneath the crate. Opening it revealed an array of implements that made Jackson's blood run cold, tools designed specifically for causing pain without immediate death. "Lieutenant Foster here learned some interesting techniques during his time on the frontier," Mills explained conversationally. "Apache methods, ironically enough. They're quite effective." Foster selected a thin, curved blade, testing its edge with his thumb. "I'll give you one chance to make this easy, Ward," he offered. "Tell us where to find the Apache camp, and we'll make your death quick." Jackson met his gaze steadily. "Go to hell." Foster sighed as if disappointed by such a predictable response. They all say that at first. He approached with the blade and Jackson steeled himself for what was to come. He had endured torture before during the war, 3 days in a Confederate prison that had left permanent scars, both physical and mental. He knew his limits, knew how long he could hold out before his mind betrayed him. But as Foster raised the blade, a commotion erupted outside, shouts followed by gunfire. The lieutenant hesitated, looking to Mills for instruction. "See what's happening," Mills ordered. "I'll watch our guest." Foster left quickly, drawing his pistol as he went. Mills moved to the small window, peering out cautiously. "Interesting," he muttered. "Your Apache friends have come to die for you." Jackson's heart sank. Takala had not fled as he'd hoped, but instead had apparently returned with reinforcements. While the thought of rescue was welcome, the idea of her risking her life for him was not. More gunfire erupted closer now. Mills turned from the window, drawing his own pistol and aiming it at Jackson's head. "If they get too close, I'll put a bullet in you. They can have your corpse." "They'll still kill you," Jackson pointed out. "Slowly, most likely. Apache are quite creative with enemies who harm their friends." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Mills' face. For all his bravado, he clearly feared Apache retribution. "Good." The door to the cellar crashed open, but instead of Foster returning or Apache warriors storming in, a bloodied figure stumbled through. Sheriff Morgan, his face bruised almost beyond recognition, collapsed to his knees just inside the entrance. Mills swung his pistol toward the new threat, momentarily forgetting Jackson. "You're supposed to be dead," he snarled. Morgan raised his head with effort. "Sorry to disappoint," he gasped, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. The distraction, brief as it was, gave Jackson the opening he needed. He threw himself sideways with all his strength, toppling the post he was tied to. As he fell, he rolled toward Mills, crashing into the man's legs and sending them both to the ground. Mills's pistol discharged the bullet, burying itself in the ceiling. The two men grappled on the floor, Jackson severely hampered by his bound limbs but fighting with desperate intensity. Morgan, despite his injuries, crawled forward and seized Mills's drop-in pistol. With shaking hands, he aimed and fired. The shot went wide, splintering the post Jackson had been tied to. Mills, realizing his disadvantage, broke free from Jackson and lunged for the door. Morgan fired again, catching Mills in the shoulder. The man staggered but didn't fall, disappearing up the cellar steps. "Sheriff," Jackson gasped, struggling against his bonds. "Are you all right?" Morgan dragged himself to Jackson's side, fumbling with bloody fingers to untie him. "Been better," he admitted hoarsely. "Harmon's men left me for dead. Would have been if not for an Apache woman. Healer." "Kimmy," Jackson realized as his hands came free. He quickly untied his ankles, then turned to assess Morgan's injuries. They were severe gunshot wound to the chest, multiple lacerations, extensive bruising. The fact that he was conscious at all was remarkable. "The journal," Morgan said urgently. "Did you Mills has it," Jackson confirmed grimly, but not for long. He helped Morgan to a sitting position against the wall, then checked the pistol, 2 shots remaining. "Stay here," he instructed. "I'll come back for you once I've dealt with Mills." Morgan grabbed his arm weakly. "Be careful. Mills is dangerous, more than Harmon in some ways." Jackson nodded, then ascended the cellar steps cautiously. The gunfire outside had intensified, suggesting a full-scale battle around the Harmon ranch. He emerged into a kitchen, deserted now as everyone had apparently rushed to defend against the Apache attack. Through a window, he caught glimpses of the chaos outside. At least a dozen Apache warriors, including Nahilze, had surrounded the ranch house. Mills' men were firing from windows and from behind overturned wagons in the yard. Bodies already littered the ground, more of Mills' men than Apache from what Jackson could see. He moved carefully through the house, searching for Mills or any sign of the journal. In what must have been Harmon's study, he found evidence of hasty packing drawers, left open papers scattered. Mills was preparing to flee. A noise from above caught his attention, footsteps moving across the upper floor. Jackson found the stairs and climbed them silently, pistol ready. The upper level contained several bedrooms, one of which had light spilling from its partially open door. He approached cautiously, listening. Inside, he could hear Mills moving around, muttering to himself as he gathered possessions. Through the gap in the door, Jackson saw him stuff the journal into a saddlebag, along with papers from Harmon's desk and what looked like maps. Jackson took a deep breath, then kicked the door open, leveling Morgan's pistol at Mills's chest. "Don't move," he ordered him. Mills froze his hand halfway to his own weapon. "Ward," he acknowledged, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You're persistent. I'll give you that." "The journal," Jackson demanded. "Put it on the bed, slowly." Mills complied with exaggerated care, never taking his eyes off Jackson. "You won't get out of here alive, you know. Even if you kill me, my men will hunt you down." "Your men are a bit preoccupied at the moment," Jackson observed. "And from what I saw, they're losing badly." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Mill's face. "The Apache will kill you too, once they're done with us. You're still a white man, Ward. Still one of the invaders they hate." "I'll take my chances," Jackson replied evenly. "Now step away from the bag." Mills took a single step back, his hands raised at shoulder height. But there was something in his posture, a coiled tension that warned Jackson he was about to make a move. When it came, it was swift and desperate. Mills flung the saddlebag at Jackson's face, simultaneously diving for his pistol. Jackson fired the shot, going wide as he ducked the flying bag. Mills recovered his weapon and fired back the bullet, grazing Jackson's arm. They faced each other across the room, both wounded, both armed. A standoff. "You should have stayed out of this, Ward," Mills said, breathing heavily. "This wasn't your fight." "It became my fight when you hanged 3 innocent women," Jackson replied. "And it's been my fight since Willow Creek." Understanding dawned in Mills's eyes. "That's what this is about, redemption." He laughed harshly. "There's no washing away what we did in the war, Ward. No forgiveness waiting for men like us." "Maybe not," Jackson conceded, "but there's still right and wrong. And this," he gestured to encompass Mills, the ranch, everything Harmon had built. "This is wrong." "Right and wrong are luxuries," Mills spat. "Survival is what matters. Power, control." Harmon understood that. "And where is Harmon now?" Jackson challenged. "Judged by the very water he sought to control. Is that the legacy you want to inherit?" Something flickered in Mill's eyes, doubt perhaps, or fear. For a moment, Jackson thought he might actually surrender. Then Mills lunged forward, firing wildly. Jackson responded in kind, his last bullet finding its mark in Mills's chest. The man staggered back, a look of surprised betrayal on his face before collapsing to the floor. Jackson approached cautiously, kicking Mills's pistol away before checking for signs of life. There were none. Victor Mills had followed his master into death, leaving only the legacy of pain and destruction they had built together. The journal lay on the floor where it had fallen from the saddlebag. Jackson retrieved it along with the maps Mills had been so intent on taking. They might prove useful in establishing the Apache claim to the water rights. Outside, the gunfire had diminished to occasional scattered shots. Jackson moved to the window, observing the yard below. The battle was clearly over. Apache warriors moved among the fallen, checking for survivors. Near the barn, Takala stood with Nahilze directing warriors to secure the property. Jackson made his way downstairs, pausing to collect Sheriff Morgan from the cellar. The older man was barely conscious now, his breathing labored and shallow. "Mills?" Morgan asked weakly as Jackson helped him up the steps. "Dead," Jackson confirmed. Morgan nodded, seemingly satisfied. The journal. Jackson patted his shirt where he had secured it once more. Safe. They emerged from the house, slowly, Jackson supporting most of Morgan's weight. At their appearance, several warriors raised weapons, but Takala called out sharply and they lowered their bows and rifles. She approached quickly, her expression relieved despite the blood spattered across her face and clothing. "You're alive," she stated, as if confirming it to herself. "Barely," Jackson admitted. "The sheriff needs help. He's badly wounded." Nahilze joined them, eyeing Morgan with concern. Kimi can tend to him, but we must leave this place. More of Harmon's men may come. As if to emphasize his point, a rider appeared on the ridge to the east, observed the scene below, then wheeled his horse and galloped away, presumably to report to whatever remained of Harmon's organization. He's right, Takula urged. We need to go. They fashioned a travois for Morgan, who had finally lost consciousness and prepared to depart. The Apache had suffered losses, 3 warriors killed, several more wounded, but had inflicted far greater damage on Mills' men. Only 2 survivors had been taken captive, and they were being guarded closely. As they left the Harmon ranch behind, Jackson rode beside Takala, the journal secure against his chest. Thank you, he said quietly, for coming back for me. She gave him a sideways glance. I told you before, we leave together or not at all. The simple statement carried a weight of meaning that neither of them was prepared to examine fully. But as they rode toward the setting sun, Jackson felt something he had not experienced in years: hope. Not for forgiveness, perhaps, but for the possibility of balance, of right actions beginning to outweigh the wrong. Behind them, dust settled over the remnants of Robert Harmon's empire. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the promise of justice if they could reach Marshal Clayton in time. And somewhere beneath the desert, the sacred water continued to flow, judging and healing, destroying and creating, as it had for countless generations before men like Harmon dreamed of owning what could never truly be possessed. The Apache camp was a flurry of activity as they prepared to break camp and move deeper into the mountains. Word had spread about the confrontation at Harmon's ranch, and scouts reported riders moving through the territory, remnants of Harmon's organization, regrouping under new leadership. In a small shelter of branches and hides, Kimi bent over Sheriff Morgan's prone form, her skilled hands applying poultices to his wounds. The sheriff's breathing was labored, his skin pallid beneath the bruises that mottled his face. Will he live? Jackson asked, ducking into the shelter with fresh water. Kimi's expression was grave. The bullet passed through his lung. There is much damage in my that I cannot see or reach. She accepted the water with a nod of thanks. His spirit is strong, but sometimes that is not enough. Jackson knelt beside the unconscious man, feeling a profound sense of responsibility. Morgan had risked everything to help them to pursue justice for both Willow Creek and the Apache massacre. We need to get him to a doctor, he said, knowing even as he spoke that it might not be possible. The nearest white doctor is in Tucson, Kimi replied, wiping Morgan's fevered brow with a damp cloth. He would not survive such a journey. Jackson sat back on his heels, considering their limited options. The journal Morgan had entrusted to him lay heavy against his chest, its evidence crucial for securing justice. But what good was justice if those who fought for it didn't live to see it done? There must be something more we can do, he insisted. Kimi was quiet for a moment, her hands continuing in their gentle ministrations. There is one possibility, she finally said, her voice low, but it would require great faith from a white man. What do you mean, the sacred spring, she explained. Not the one where Harmon met his judgment, but another smaller hidden deeper in our lands. Its waters have healing properties beyond what my herbs can provide. Hope flickered in Jackson's chest. Where is this spring? A day's ride to the north in the Shadow Mountains. Kimi met his gaze directly. But Nahilze will not approve. The spring is one of our most closely guarded secrets, never revealed to outsiders. And yet, you're telling me, Jackson observed. A small smile touched her lips. Because I have seen your heart, Jackson Ward. And because I believe you were brought to us for a purpose that is not yet fulfilled. Before Jackson could respond, the shelter flap opened and Takala entered, her expression tense. Nahilze has called a council, she announced. The scouts have returned with troubling news. Jackson followed her to the center of the camp, where Nahilze stood with several warriors and elders. Diani sat slightly apart, her young face composed but solemn, as she listened to the scout's report. Jackson was struck again by how others deferred to her despite her youth. Nahilze acknowledged Jackson with a nod as he joined the circle. Our scouts report that a man named Randall has taken control of Harmon's operations, he explained in English for Jackson's benefit. He has sent telegrams to mining companies and to the Southern Pacific Railroad, claiming to have secured water rights for the territory. That's impossible, Jackson objected. Harmon is dead, Mills is dead, the legal claim would die with them. Unless there were other partners, Takala suggested grimly, or unless Harmon left instructions in case of his death. Nahilze nodded. The scouts also report that Randall has sent for reinforcements, not just hired guns, but men with government connections. They speak of a federal judge arriving within days to ratify the water claims. The implications were clear. If a federal judge validated Harmon's claimed water rights, the Apache would lose any legal recourse. The journal's evidence might implicate Harmon in past crimes, but it wouldn't necessarily invalidate business arrangements he had made. We need to get to Tucson, Jackson insisted. Find Marshal Clayton, present our evidence before this judge arrives. Too dangerous, Nahilze countered. Randall's men will be watching all routes to Tucson, and he gestured toward the shelter where Morgan lay. The sheriff, we cannot travel. I could go alone, Jackson suggested. I'm less recognizable than any Apache rider. And more vulnerable, Takala argued. They know your face now, Jackson. They would kill you on sight. Silence fell over the gathering as they contemplated their dwindling options. It was Diani who finally spoke, her voice soft yet somehow commanding everyone's attention. We must divide our strength, she said, rising from her seated position. Some must go to Tucson with the evidence. Others must take Sheriff Morgan to the healing spring. Murmurs of surprise and objection rose from the elders. The healing spring was clearly not something to be mentioned lightly, let alone suggested as a destination for an outsider. Nahilze raised his hand for silence. Diana, you know our laws, the sacred places. I know what the water told me. She interrupted, a boldness that startled even her sisters. When Harmon was judged, the spirits spoke. They said the water must serve both justice and healing if balance is to be restored. An uncomfortable silence followed her pronouncement. Jackson glanced at Takala, who appeared both surprised and concerned by her younger sister's assertion. Kimmy, emerging from the shelter, moved to stand supportively beside Diani. The girl speaks with the voice of the water spirits now. One of the elders finally said, his weathered face grave, We must listen. Nahilze studied Diani for a long moment, then nodded slowly. What do you propose? Chaitan and 2 warriors will take the evidence to Tucson, traveling by night and using paths only Apache know, she said with surprising authority. Jackson, Takala, and I will take the sheriff to the healing spring. Kimmy will guide us. And the rest? Nahilze asked. We'll move the camp deeper into the mountains and prepare for whatever comes next, Diani replied, whether it be peace or war. The elder who had spoken before stroked his chin thoughtfully. The girl's plan has wisdom, but there is great risk in dividing our strength this way. There is greater risk in doing nothing, Takala pointed out, or in keeping all our hopes in one place where a single defeat would end everything. Discussion erupted among the council members, some arguing for more aggressive action, a direct attack on Randall and his men, while others favored retreating deeper into Apache territory and abandoning any engagement with white authorities. Throughout the debate, Jackson observed how Takala advocated for a middle path, neither complete trust in white justice nor total rejection of it. She argued instead for using every available means to secure their rights and protect their land. The water rights are not just about our band, she reminded the council. If Randall secures them for the railroad, all Apache in the territory will suffer. The desert will be carved up, the sacred places desecrated, our people pushed onto even smaller reservations. Her words carried weight, especially when supported by Diani's quiet but firm nods of agreement. The alliance between the sisters was powerful, Takala's strategic mind complemented by Diani's newfound spiritual authority. Eventually, Nahilze called for a decision. "We will follow Diani's plan," he announced. "Chatan will depart for Tucson in at nightfall with 2 warriors in the evidence. Jackson, Ward, Takala, Diani, and Kimmy will take the sheriff to the healing spring at first light. The rest of us will move deeper into the mountains to the place of red stones." As the council dispersed, Jackson approached Nahilze privately. "Thank you for trusting me with knowledge of the sacred spring," he said. "I understand what that means." The war chief's expression was solemn. "It is not my trust that guides this decision, but Diani's. Since the water judged Harmon, she has changed. The spirits speak through her now." He gripped Jackson's arm firmly. "Do not make her faith in you a mistake." "I won't," Jackson promised, feeling the weight of that trust settle alongside his other responsibilities. As preparations were made for the divided journeys, Jackson found himself beside Sheriff Morgan's shelter, watching as Kimmy carefully prepared the lawman for travel. "How will we move him?" he asked. "He's in no condition to ride." "We'll use a travois," Kimmy explained, referring to the frame of poles typically used by plains tribes to transport goods or wounded. "The journey will not be easy for him, but staying here would mean certain death." Inside the shelter, Morgan stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Ward," he called weakly. Jackson knelt beside him immediately. "I'm here, Sheriff." Morgan's hand fumbled for Jackson's, gripping it with surprising strength. "The journal," he rasped. "Did you—" "I have it," Jackson assured him. "Safe and sound. We're sending it to Marshal Clayton in Tucson." Relief softened the sheriff's pain-lined face. "Good. That's good." His breath rattled ominously in his chest. "Don't let Harmon win, Ward. Not after everything." "Harmon's dead," Jackson reminded him gently. "And we'll stop Randall, too." Morgan managed a weak smile. "Justice comes for all men, eventually." His eyes closed again, strength exhausted by the brief conversation. Kimmy placed a comforting hand on Jackson's shoulder. "Rest now," she advised. "Tomorrow's journey will test us all." As Jackson left the shelter, he found Takala waiting outside, her face illuminated by the fading sunset. Something in her expression made him pause. "What is it?" he asked. "My sister," she said, nodding toward where Diani sat with the elders deep in conversation. "She was always the gentlest of us, the most afraid. Now she speaks with authority that makes even the war chief listen." "The water changed her," Jackson suggested, recalling what Nahilze had said. Takala nodded slowly. "The old stories speak of such things, of how the sacred waters sometimes choose a vessel to carry their wisdom. But I never expected—" Her voice trailed off, emotion briefly overcoming her usual composure. "You're worried about her," Jackson observed. "Such gifts come with a heavy price," Takala replied softly. "Those who speak for the spirits often lose themselves in the process." Jackson followed her gaze to Diani, who indeed seemed transformed from the frightened girl he had cut down from the hanging tree. There was a centered calm about her now, a quiet certainty that seemed beyond her years. "She's still your sister," he offered, "and she has you and Kimmy to keep her grounded." Takala's smile was tinged with sadness. "Let us hope that is enough." As night fell, final preparations were made for Chatan's departure. The young warrior accepted the journal with solemn ceremony, securing it inside his shirt before mounting his horse. 2 other warriors would accompany him, taking different routes to ensure at least one of them reached Tucson with the evidence. "Ride swift, see far," Nahilze told them in the traditional Apache farewell. "Return with honor," they responded in unison before disappearing into the darkness. Jackson watched them go, acutely aware that the fate of both the Apache and Sheriff Morgan now rested on the success of these divided missions. If Chatan failed to reach Marshal Clayton, or if the healing spring proved unable to save Morgan, all might be lost. That night, as the camp prepared for its own departure at dawn, Jackson found himself unable to sleep. He sat outside his assigned shelter, staring at the star-filled sky while turning his pocket watch over and over in his hands. Your wife, Diani's voice came softly from nearby. She approached and sat beside him, her movements graceful and deliberate. Jackson nodded, thumbing open the catch to reveal Elizabeth's face in the starlight. She died while I was away at war. Fever took her and our son. Diani studied the image with interest. She had kind eyes. She did, Jackson agreed, a familiar ache tightening his chest. She was the best person I've ever known. Better than I deserved. And yet she chose you, Diani observed. She must have seen something worthy. Jackson closed the watch with a soft click. Maybe once, before Willow Creek, before I failed to stop a massacre. Diani was quiet for a moment, her face thoughtful in the moonlight. My father used to say that failure is not in being unable to prevent evil, but in failing to stand against it at all. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was. She looked up at the stars, her expression distant. He visits me sometimes in dreams, as he visited you. Jackson stiffened in surprise. How did you know? The water shows me things now, she explained simply. Past events, sometimes future ones. I saw him tell you that water would wash away your sins. A chill ran down Jackson's spine despite the warm night. Is that possible, to wash away the things I've done, the things I failed to do? Donnie considered the question with a seriousness beyond her years. Not wash away, perhaps, but balance. Each good action balances a bad one. Each life saved balances a life lost. This is the way of the desert, harsh, but fair. And Sheriff Morgan, Jackson asked, will the healing spring save him? Her eyes met his, ancient in her young face. That depends as much on you as on the water. On me, how? The water responds to the heart of the one who brings the wounded, she explained. If your intention is pure, the healing will be stronger. Jackson pondered this, wondering if his intentions were indeed pure. He wanted to save Morgan, certainly, but was it for Morgan's sake, or for his own redemption, for justice, or for personal absolution? As if reading his thoughts, Diani placed a gentle hand on his arm. The water does not require perfection, Jackson warned. Only honesty. With that cryptic statement, she rose and left him to his contemplations. Jackson remained awake for a long time afterward, watching the stars wheel overhead and wondering what the next day would bring. Dawn broke with the hushed preparations of a camp preparing to scatter in multiple directions. Nahilze's group would head east into the deeper mountains. Jackson's party himself, Takala Diani, and the gravely wounded Sheriff Morgan on a travois would journey north to the healing spring. They set out as the first rays of sunlight crested the eastern mountains, Morgan secured to the travois being pulled by Jackson's horse senator. The sheriff had fallen into a state of semi-consciousness, occasionally muttering deliriously, but mostly silent, his breathing increasingly labored. How far to this spring? Jackson asked Kimmy, who rode beside the travois, frequently checking Morgan's condition. A full day's ride, she replied, concern evident in her voice. If he survives that long. Takala led their small party, her keen eyes constantly scanning the terrain for signs of danger. Diani rode behind the travois, occasionally singing softly in Apache healing songs. Kimmy explained to help strengthen Morgan's spirit for the journey. They traveled through increasingly rugged country, following game trails and ancient Apache paths that no white man had likely ever seen. Jackson marveled at the sisters' ability to navigate the complex landscape, finding passages where he would have seen only impassable terrain. By midday, they had climbed into higher elevations where pine and juniper replaced the desert scrub. The air was cooler here, scented with resin and wild herbs. They paused briefly to rest the horses and check on Morgan, whose condition had worsened during the climb. His breathing is more difficult, Kimmy reported grimly after examining him. The blood in his lungs increases. Can you do anything? Jackson asked, kneeling beside the sheriff's still form. Kimmy shook her head. My herbs can ease his pain, but not heal such damage. Only the spring might save him now. Then we continue. Takala decided, already remounting her horse. We cannot afford to linger. As they pressed on, Jackson found himself riding beside Takala, who had been unusually quiet throughout the journey, her attention focused on the path ahead. You're worried, he observed, about more than just Mills's men finding us. She glanced at him, her expression guarded. The healing spring is sacred to our people. No outsider has ever been brought there. And you think it's a mistake to take us there now. Takala was silent for a long moment, considering her response. I think, she finally said, that these are unprecedented times. The old ways must sometimes bend if they are to survive. But you're not convinced, Jackson pressed. I trust my sister's vision, she replied firmly. Diane says the water has chosen you for a purpose. That's enough for me. And what if she's wrong? What if I'm not worthy of this trust? Takala's smile was unexpected, a brief softening of her usually stern features. Then I will kill you myself, she said, though the glint in her eye suggested it might not be entirely serious. They rode in companionable silence after that, the tension between them eased somewhat by the shared moment of almost humor. Jackson found himself increasingly drawn to this complex woman, fierce warrior, protective sister, reluctant visionary. She carried her responsibilities with a grace that belied their weight. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the terrain grew increasingly vertical. They navigated narrow switchbacks up a mountain face, the horses picking their way carefully along the precarious trail. Below them, the desert stretched out like a vast tawny sea, the diminishing light casting long shadows across its surface. We're close, Kimmy announced as they reached a relatively flat section of trail. The spring lies just beyond the next ridge. Jackson felt a surge of hope, quickly tempered by concern as he checked on Morgan. The sheriff's breathing had become alarmingly shallow, his skin waxy and pale beneath the bruising. Hurry, Kimmy urged, noting Morgan's deteriorating condition. He fades quickly now. They pushed forward with renewed urgency, cresting the ridge just as the sun touched the western horizon. The view beyond took Jackson's breath away. A small, perfectly circular valley lay nestled between towering cliffs, its floor carpeted with lush vegetation that seemed impossible in the desert region. A crystal-clear pool occupied the center, fed by a slender waterfall that cascaded down one cliff face. The last rays of sunlight struck the falling water, creating a shimmering rainbow that arced across the pool. The healing spring, Diane announced, her voice filled with reverence. They descended into the valley along a narrow path, the horses moving carefully on the steep grade. As they neared the bottom, Jackson could feel a change in the air, a freshness, a vitality that seemed to infuse every breath. The vegetation around them grew increasingly lush, with flowers blooming in profusion despite the late season. At the valley floor, they dismounted near the pool's edge. Up close, the water was so clear that Jackson could see every pebble on the bottom despite the pool's considerable depth. A slight steam rose from the surface, suggesting the water was warmer than the cooling evening air. What now? Jackson asked, looking to Kimmy for guidance. We must prepare him, she replied, already moving to the travois. And ourselves, the water requires proper respect. With gentle efficiency, Kimmy and Diane removed Morgan's clothing, leaving him covered only with a light blanket. Takala busied herself gathering specific plants from around the pool's edge, which she then crushed between stones, creating a pungent paste. This will help open his spirit to the water's influence, she explained, applying the paste to Morgan's forehead, chest, and palms. Diane approached Jackson, holding a small bowl of the same paste. You must be prepared as well, she said, since you will enter the water with him. Me? Jackson asked, surprised. I thought, the one who brings the wounded must support them in the healing, Gianni explained. Your strength will help sustain him when the water begins its work. Jackson hesitated only briefly before nodding his acceptance. He removed his shirt, allowing Diane to apply the paste to his skin. The mixture tingled where it touched, creating a sensation of warmth that spread outward from each point of contact. As the last light faded from the sky, Kimmy and Takala carefully transferred Morgan to a woven mat of reeds that they had constructed with remarkable speed. Jackson helped them carry the unconscious sheriff to the pool's edge. "Now we pray," Diani said softly, kneeling beside the water. The three sisters began to sing in Apache, their voices blending in a haunting melody that echoed off the surrounding cliffs. The sound seemed to make the very air vibrate, creating an atmosphere of profound solemnity. When the song ended, Diani rose and turned to Jackson. "Take him into the deepest part," she instructed. "Hold him so that his face remains above water, but the rest of him is submerged. The water must be able to reach his wounds." Jackson nodded, removing his boots before carefully lifting Morgan from the reed mat. The sheriff was alarmingly light in his arms, wasted by his injuries and the difficult journey. He waded into the pool, surprised by the water's warmth despite the cool evening air. It felt different from ordinary water, somehow slightly more viscous, with a mineral quality that left his skin tingling where it touched. Following Diani's instructions, he moved to the center of the pool where the water reached his chest. He cradled Morgan carefully, supporting the sheriff's head above the surface while ensuring the rest of his body was submerged. "Now what?" he called to the sisters who remained at the edge watching intently. "Now we wait," Kimmy replied, "and you pray in whatever way you know how. Pray." It had been years since Jackson had directed thoughts toward any higher power. The war had stripped away much of his faith, and what remained had died with Elizabeth and their son. Yet here in this sacred place, with a dying man in his arms and three Apache women trusting him with their most closely guarded secret, he found himself searching for words. Not prayers from his childhood church with their formal cadences and distant deity, something more immediate, more honest. "I don't know if anyone is listening," he thought, gazing up at the stars now appearing overhead. "I don't know if I deserve to be heard, but this man deserves to live. He's fought for justice when others looked away. He's risked everything to right wrongs that most would prefer to forget." As he held Morgan in the warm waters, Jackson became aware of a subtle change. The tingling sensation from the paste was intensifying, spreading throughout his body. The water around them seemed to pulse with an inner light, barely perceptible but unmistakably real. "If there's any balance to be had in this world," he continued silently, "any justice beyond what we imperfect humans can create, then let this man live. Let his courage and sacrifice mean something." Morgan stirred in his arms, a soft moan escaping his lips. His eyelids fluttered, though they didn't open. The water around them was definitely glowing now, a soft blue luminescence that illuminated their bodies from below. From the shore, the sisters continued their song, the melody rising and falling like the breath of the earth itself. Jackson felt himself becoming part of it, his own breathing synchronizing with the rhythm, his heartbeat aligning with some greater pulse he could feel but not name. And then with startling suddenness, Morgan's eyes snapped open. They were filled with the same blue light that suffused the water, giving his gaze an otherworldly quality. His back arched, his body going rigid in Jackson's arms. "Hold him," Kimmy called urgently from the shore. "Whatever happens, don't let go." Morgan began to thrash his movements, powered by a strength that seemed impossible given his condition. Jackson struggled to maintain his grip, fighting to keep the sheriff's head above water as he convulsed. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the seizure passed. Morgan went limp in Jackson's arms, his eyes closing once more. But his breathing had changed deeper, more regular, without the rattling sound that had characterized it before. "Bring him out," Johnny called. "The water has done what it can." Jackson waded back to shore, Morgan still cradled in his arms. As he emerged from the pool, he was struck by how much lighter his own body felt, as if some burden had been lifted from his shoulders along with Morgan's healing. They laid the sheriff on the reed mat where Kimmy examined him with careful hands. "The wounds are closing," she reported with quiet amazement. "Inside and out. I can hear his breathing clearing." Indeed, color was returning to Morgan's face, the waxy pallor replaced by a healthier hue. His chest rose and fell in a strong, steady rhythm, and when Kimmy pressed her ear to his chest, she smiled at what she heard. The water has healed him, she confirmed. Not completely, he will need rest and care, but he will live. Relief washed over Jackson so profound it made his knees weak. He sank to the ground beside the mat, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. And you, Diani said, kneeling beside him with concern. The water has taken much of your strength to accomplish this healing. Jackson hadn't considered that possibility, that his own vitality might be required for Morgan's recovery. Yet it made a certain sense, a balance of energy exchanged rather than created from nothing. A fair trade, he managed, though his voice sounded distant to his own ears. Takala brought him water to drink, ordinary water, not from the sacred pool, and helped him move to a more comfortable position against a boulder. Rest, she advised. We'll camp here tonight. It's safe. As the sisters busied themselves with making camp, Jackson drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind filled with vivid, dreamlike images. Elizabeth smiling at him without the sadness that had haunted her final portrait. Chief Maka nodding in approval, the faces of those he had managed to save at Willow Creek alongside those he had failed. And through it all, water flowing, cleansing, healing, judging. Water that took and water that gave. Water that remembered and water that renewed. When he fully regained consciousness, the moon had risen high above the valley, bathing everything in silver light. Morgan lay nearby, his breathing deep and regular in healthy sleep rather than unconsciousness. The sisters had made a small, smokeless fire around which they sat in quiet conversation. Jackson sat up, feeling surprisingly restored despite the lingering exhaustion in his limbs. Takala noticed his movement and brought him a bowl of something warm and savory, a broth of sorts rich with unfamiliar herbs. Drink, she instructed. It will help restore what the water took. He accepted gratefully, the broth warming him from the inside as he sipped. Thank you, he said, encompassing far more than just the food in those simple words. Takala seemed to understand. She sat beside him, her own bowl cradled in her hands. The water accepted you, she observed. Not all who enter the pool are found worthy. What happens to those who aren't? Jackson asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. The water rejects them, she replied simply, sometimes violently. Jackson thought of Harmon pulled under by the water in the sacred spring. Had that been a rejection, a judgment, or something else entirely? Your sister said the water judges, he noted, but also heals. Takala nodded. Two aspects of the same power. Like the desert itself, it can kill with thirst or nourish with hidden springs. The difference lies in how you approach it. And how one approaches the water determines which aspect responds. Partly, she agreed, but the water also sees into the heart. Harmon approached with greed and arrogance. You approached with humility and sacrifice. Jackson considered this as he finished his broth. The concept wasn't so different from the faith he had been raised in, a higher power that could both punish and redeem, depending on the heart of the supplicant. What happens now, he asked, setting aside the empty bowl. Morgan is healing, but Randall is still moving to claim the water rights. And we don't know if Shaitan has reached Marshal Clayton yet. We wait until morning, Takala replied. Morgan should be strong enough to travel by then. We'll return to the main camp and plan our next move. As if summoned by their discussion, Diani approached, her young face solemn in the firelight. We won't be returning to the main camp, she announced. We must go to Tucson. Takala frowned. Tucson? That's too dangerous. Randall's men will be expecting Apache warriors or a lone white man, Diani interrupted. Not two Apache women traveling with a wounded sheriff and a ranch owner. She looked directly at Jackson. The water has shown me the path. We must testify ourselves, not rely on documents alone. Kimmy had joined them, her expression concerned. Diani, the risk is necessary, Diani insisted. The journal alone may not be enough. The judge Randall has summoned is not an honest man. He will need to see faces, hear voices to be swayed from Randall's influence. The certainty in her voice was compelling. Jackson glanced at Morgan, whose color continued to improve as he slept. The sheriff could confirm the journal's authenticity, he suggested. His testimony would carry weight with a federal marshal. Takala still looked skeptical. And how do we reach Tucson without being intercepted? Randall's men will be watching all the main roads. Not all, Johnny countered. The water has shown me a path through the desert, a difficult one known only to the oldest of our people. It will take us around Randall's watchers. Jackson watched the sisters exchange with interest. There was a new dynamic between them now. Takala, always the leader, now deferring somewhat to Diani's visions. Kimmy, the mediator, looking increasingly torn between practical concerns and spiritual guidance. I believe her, he said, finally drawing all three sisters' attention. If Diani says we must go to Tucson, then we should go. Takala studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Very well, we leave at first light. She rose and moved away to check on their horses, her posture suggesting she was not entirely convinced, but willing to trust her sister's guidance. Kimmy followed, leaving Jackson alone with Diani by the fire. The young woman sat beside him, her gaze fixed on the flames. Thank you for supporting me, she said quietly. Takala finds it difficult to follow rather than lead. She's protected you both for a long time, Jackson observed. It's not easy to let go of that responsibility. Diani nodded thoughtfully. The water changes all it touches. Me, you, even Takala, though she resists it more than most. And what does the water want from us? Jackson asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Beyond testifying in Tucson, Diani's eyes reflecting the firelight seemed older than her years as she considered his question. Balance, she finally said. The water seeks balance in all things, between taking and giving, between judgment and mercy. She looked at him directly, between what was lost at Willow Creek and what might be saved here. The parallel struck Jackson forcefully. Two massacres, years and miles apart, yet connected by the man who had ordered them. And now a chance to prevent a third, the slow destruction of the Apache way of life through the theft of their water. I couldn't save them then. He acknowledged the familiar guilt rising like bile in his throat. But maybe I can help save your people now. Diani touched his arm gently. That is why the water accepted you, Jackson Ward. Not because you are without fault, but because you seek to balance what was done. Her words offered a perspective on redemption that Jackson had never considered, not the erasure of past sins, but their balancing through present actions. Not forgiveness exactly, but a restoration of equilibrium. It was a concept that resonated with him far more deeply than the abstract absolution he had been raised to seek. As she left him to his thoughts, returning to her sisters by the horses, Jackson found himself looking up at the star-filled sky with a sense of purpose he had not felt since before the war. Tomorrow they would ride for Tucson, facing unknown dangers with uncertain allies. But for the first time in years, he felt he was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. Whether that was enough to secure justice for the Apache or balance for his own soul remained to be seen. But it was at least a beginning. They set out at first light, Morgan riding double with Jackson still weak, but remarkably improved from his near-death state the previous day. The sheriff had awakened briefly during the night, confused but coherent, and had agreed to their plan to seek out Marshal Clayton in Tucson. The journal, he had insisted, his voice hoarse but stronger than before. Clayton needs to see it and hear my testimony. We'll get you there, Jackson had promised. Just focus on regaining your strength. Now as they descended from the hidden valley of the healing spring, Morgan sat upright in the saddle before Jackson, occasionally wincing at the movement, but clearly determined to complete their journey. Diani led them on a route that appeared non-existent to Jackson's eyes, a barely perceptible game trail that wound through seemingly impassable terrain. They traveled in silence, aware that Randall's men might be anywhere in the territory. By midday, they had reached the desert floor where Diani directed them toward a series of dry washes that provided both cover and a relatively easy path for the horses. The sun beat down mercilessly, and Jackson was grateful for the water skins Kimmy had filled before their departure. "How far to Tucson?" he asked during a brief rest in the shade of an overhanging rock. "2 days if we push hard," Takala replied, scanning the horizon with practiced eyes. "The difficult part will be the final approach. Randall will have men watching all roads into the city." "We won't use roads," Diani assured them. "The water has shown me another way." Morgan, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "This water you keep mentioning," he said, his voice still rough but gaining strength. "The one that healed me. What exactly is it?" The sisters exchanged glances, clearly uncertain how much to reveal to an outsider, even one they had saved. "It is sacred to our people," Kimmy explained carefully. "A gift from the spirits that both judges and heals depending on the heart of the one who approaches it." Morgan nodded slowly, accepting this limited explanation. "Well, whatever it is, I'm grateful. I was at death's door. I could feel myself slipping away." He looked at Jackson. "And I gather you had something to do with my recovery as well." Jackson shrugged uncomfortably. "I just held you in the water. The spring did the real work." "Nevertheless," Morgan insisted, "I owe you my life, all of you." His gaze swept over the sisters with genuine gratitude. "And I won't forget it when we reach Tucson." They continued their journey through the afternoon, the landscape gradually transforming from rugged mountain terrain to the more open desert that surrounded Tucson. They saw no signs of Randall's men, which both relieved and concerned Jackson. Either Diani's route was truly unknown to outsiders, or their enemies were concentrating their forces elsewhere, perhaps closer to their destination. As dusk approached, they made camp in a dry creek bed, foregoing a fire despite the growing chill. A cold meal of dried meat and hardtack was shared in near silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what awaited them in Tucson. Morgan, who had grown stronger throughout the day, sat beside Jackson as the sisters conferred quietly nearby. "Those women," the sheriff observed in a low voice. "They're something special, aren't they?" Jackson nodded, watching as Takala gestured emphatically during her discussion with her sisters. "They've survived things that would break most people, lost everything except each other, and still they fight. For their land," Morgan agreed, "their water, their way of life." He studied Jackson with shrewd eyes. "And you're fighting with them now. Quite a change from when I first met you." Jackson shrugged. "Sometimes you find a cause worth fighting for when you least expect it." "Or people worth fighting for," Morgan suggested with a knowing look toward Takala. Jackson didn't respond directly, unwilling to examine too closely the complex feelings he had developed for the fierce Apache woman. Instead, he changed the subject. "What can we expect in Tucson? Will Marshal Clayton listen to us?" Morgan's expression grew serious. "Clayton's a good man, honest as lawmen go, but he's also practical. He'll need compelling evidence to move against someone with Randall's connections. The journal isn't enough." "It's a start," Morgan conceded. "But journals can be forged. Testimonies can be bought. He'll need more to convince a federal judge to invalidate water rights that have already been registered." "What kind of more?" Morgan hesitated. "Ideally, Harmon himself confessing to his crimes." Jackson laughed bitterly. "That would be difficult considering he's at the bottom of an underground spring." "Yes, well," Morgan sighed. "Barring that, we'll need corroborating witnesses, other survivors from Willow Creek, Army records of the incident if they exist. And for the Apache massacre," Morgan's expression darkened, "that will be harder. Crimes against Indians rarely receive the same attention as crimes against whites, even with federal marshals." It was an ugly truth, but one Jackson had seen play out too many times to dispute. "So we're risking everything on a long shot." "We're risking everything on doing what's right," Morgan corrected firmly, "whether it succeeds or not." Before Jackson could respond, Diani approached, her expression grave. Someone comes, she said quietly. Many riders from the east. Jackson and Morgan rose immediately following her to where Takala and Kimmy were already watching the horizon. In the gathering dusk, a cloud of dust marked the approach of a sizable group, perhaps a dozen riders moving at a steady pace along the main trail to Tucson. Randall's men, Jackson asked, straining to make out details in the fading light. No, Takala replied, her keen eyes picking up what his could not. Apache, Nahilze's warriors. Relief washed over Jackson. They must be heading to Tucson as well. Perhaps Chictan reached them with news. They watched as the Apache riders passed about a half-mile distant, unaware of their presence in the concealed creek bed. Diani seemed troubled, her brow furrowed as she tracked their progress. Something is wrong, she murmured. They ride too openly, too directly. Jackson hadn't considered that, but she was right. Nihilze was too experienced a warrior to lead his men so visibly across exposed terrain, especially knowing Randall's forces were watching for Apache movement. It's a trap, Morgan realized aloud. They're trying to draw out Randall's watchers. Or they're being followed, Takala suggested grimly, lured into an ambush of their own. As if confirming her fear, a distant flash of light caught Jackson's attention, the last rays of sun reflecting off metal on a ridge overlooking the Apache rider's path. There, he pointed, on the ridge. Riflemen. Takala saw it too, her body tensing like a drawn bow. We have to warn them. If we reveal ourselves, we risk everything, Morgan cautioned. Our mission to Tucson, the evidence, all of it. A heavy silence fell as they all recognized the impossible choice. Before them maintain their course toward Tucson and the longer-term justice it might bring, or intervene to save lives immediately at risk. It was Diani who broke the silence, her voice carrying the same certainty it had at the healing spring. The water does not ask us to choose between justice and mercy, she said. It demands both in balance. Takala nodded, decision made. Kimmy, stay with Morgan. The three of us will try to warn Nahilze. I'm coming too, Morgan insisted, struggling to his feet. I can still shoot. You'll slow us down, Takala countered bluntly, and we'll need to move fast. Morgan looked as if he might argue further, but Jackson placed a hand on his shoulder. She's right. You're better than you were, but nowhere near full strength. Stay with Kimmy. If we don't return by dawn, continue to Tucson. Find Clayton. The sheriff reluctantly agreed, sinking back to the ground with obvious frustration. Jackson, Takala, and Diani prepared quickly, taking only essential weapons and water. They would approach on foot using the gathering darkness for cover. The ambush site was perhaps a mile away across open desert. Difficult terrain to cross undetected, but not impossible for those skilled in desert movement. As they prepared to leave, Kimmy embraced each of her sisters, then surprised Jackson by doing the same to him. Return safely, she whispered. All of you. They set out at a ground-eating lope, moving in single file with Takala leading. Despite his military experience, Jackson found himself struggling to match the Apache women's ability to move silently across the desert. Every loose stone he dislodged seemed to echo like a gunshot in the quiet night. They paused at the base of the ridge where Jackson had spotted the riflemen. Above them, they could now make out the silhouettes of several men positioned along the ridgeline, rifles trained on the trail below, where Nahilze's group would soon pass. At least 8 shooters, Takala whispered. Probably more we can't see. And Nahilze's group, Jackson asked. 12 warriors, she confirmed, but they'll be exposed on the trail with no warning. We need to create a diversion, Diani suggested. Draw their fire away from Nahilze long enough for him to seek cover. Jackson considered their limited options. If we start a fire on the far side of the ridge, it might pull some of them away. The rest we'll have to deal with directly. Takala nodded her agreement. Diani, circle around and start the fire when you see Nahilze's group approach. Jackson and I will take positions to pick off the riflemen who remain. As Diani slipped away to fulfill her task, Takala led Jackson up a narrow game trail that switchbacked up the ridge, positioning them behind and slightly above several of the waiting ambushers. In the darkness, their approach went undetected, the riflemen's attention fixed on the trail below. Jackson and Takala separated, each taking position behind cover with clear lines of fire to different targets. The minutes stretched endlessly as they waited for Diane's signal, the only sound the occasional murmur of conversation among the unsuspecting riflemen. Then from the far side of the ridge, a flicker of orange light bloomed against the night sky. Flames leapt upward quickly, growing into a substantial blaze that illuminated the entire area with flickering light. The effect was immediate. Several of the ambushers rose in alarm, pointing toward the fire and shouting to their companions. A man who appeared to be their leader began issuing orders directing half his force to investigate the fire while the others maintained their positions. As the group split, Jackson caught Takala's eye across the distance and nodded. They had reduced the odds, but they needed to act before Nahilze's group came into view. Takala struck first her bow, making only the softest whisper as she loosed an arrow that found its mark in the leader's chest. He fell with barely a sound, the shock evident on his face even in the dim light. Jackson fired next, his rifle cracking loudly in the night air as he took down one of the remaining riflemen. The others reacted immediately, diving for cover and firing blindly toward the perceived threats. Below, Nahilze's warriors had heard the commotion and halted their advance, quickly dispersing from the trail into defensive positions. The ambush had been foiled, but now Jackson and Takalaye found themselves pinned down by return fire from the remaining riflemen. Bullets whined overhead as Jackson pressed himself against the boulder, waiting for a break in the fusillade. Across the ridge, he could see Takala, similarly concealed, calmly nocking another arrow despite the danger. A shout from below indicated that Nahilze had assessed the situation and was organizing a counterattack. The riflemen, now caught between attackers from above and below, began to falter in their response. Two broke cover and ran toward where their companions had gone to investigate the fire. Jackson took aim at one but held his fire when an arrow from Takala dropped the man mid-stride. The other disappeared into the darkness beyond the firelight's reach. The remaining riflemen, now only three, realized their position was untenable. They threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender, just as Nahilze and his warriors reached their position. The brief but intense battle was over. As Jackson and Takala descended to join the others, Diane emerged from the darkness, her face illuminated by the still-burning fire she had set. Nahilze greeted them with surprise and evident relief. "You have saved many lives tonight," he acknowledged, clasping arms with each of them in turn. "But why are you here? You were supposed to be at the healing spring." "We were," Takala explained quickly. "The sheriff is recovering. We're on our way to Tucson to testify before Marshal Clayton." Nahilze's expression grew grave. "Then our paths align. Chaitan reached us with news the federal judge Randall summoned has already arrived in Tucson. The hearing on the water rights is set for 2 days from now." 2 days, Jackson echoed, dismayed. "That's barely enough time to reach Tucson, let alone prepare our case. Hence our direct approach," Nahilze confirmed grimly. "We cannot afford caution now. Speed is essential." One of the captured riflemen laughed bitterly from where he sat guarded by Apache warriors. "You're all fools," he sneered. "Judge Hollister is already in Randall's pocket. The water rights will be confirmed no matter what evidence you bring." Jackson approached the man, studying his face in the firelight. "You seem very certain of that." "It's already done," the man insisted. "Papers signed and money changed hands. This is just a formality to make it all legal-like." Nahilze's expression hardened. "Then we must ensure the formality does not proceed as planned." The implication was clear, and Jackson felt a chill at the potential for violence. "If we disrupt the hearing by force, we'll only confirm every prejudice against the Apache," he warned. "We need to win this legally or we lose everything." "And if the law is corrupt," Nahilze challenged, "then we find a way to expose the corruption," Jackson insisted. "Marshal Clayton may be our best hope for that." After a tense moment, Nehelze nodded his agreement. "We will try your way first," he conceded, "but I will not watch my people lose their water, their land, their future to thieves who hide behind corrupt laws." Plans were quickly made. They would return to where Kimmy and Morgan waited, then proceed to Tucson together at first light. Nahilze would lead most of his warriors by a more circuitous route, positioning them around the city as a precaution should negotiations fail. As they prepared to depart, Diane approached Jackson privately. "You were right to counsel against violence," she said quietly. "The water seeks balance, not more bloodshed." "Will your uncle listen?" Jackson asked, concerned by the barely contained fury he had seen in Nahilze's eyes. "He will try," Johnny replied, "but his patience has limits. He has watched too many promises broken, too many treaties violated." Jackson understood that all too well. The history between white settlers and native peoples was littered with broken promises and betrayals. Why should Nahilze expect this time to be any different? "Then we need to succeed," he said simply, "for everyone's sake." They rejoined the others, leaving their prisoners, bound but unharmed, for their companions to find. As they traveled back to their camp, Jackson found himself riding beside Takala, whose silence suggested deep preoccupation. "Having second thoughts," he ventured. She glanced at him, moonlight silvering her profile. "About going to Tucson number, about whether it will make any difference." She shrugged. "Perhaps." "The captured man could have been lying," Jackson suggested, "trying to demoralize us." "He wasn't lying," Takala replied with certainty. "I've seen too many white officials purchased like cattle at market. Why should this judge be different?" Jackson had no ready answer for that. The corruption she described was all too real, especially in frontier territories where oversight was minimal and opportunities for profit abundant. "Not all white men are corrupt," he finally said, though it sounded weak even to his own ears. Takala's smile held no humor. "No, some like you merely stand by while the corrupt ones act." The barb struck home all the more painful for its essential truth. How many times had he witnessed injustice without intervening? How many wrongs had he allowed to pass unchallenged because they didn't directly affect him? "That's fair," he acknowledged quietly. "I've been a coward in more ways than one." Takala studied him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. "And yet here you are riding toward danger rather than away from it. Perhaps people can change." "Perhaps," Jackson agreed, though doubt still gnawed at him. One good deed or even several couldn't erase years of inaction. Could it? As if reading his thoughts, Takala added, "The water judged you worthy, Jackson Ward. That counts for something, even if you don't believe it yourself." Before he could respond, they crested a rise and their camp came into view. Kimmy and Morgan were waiting anxiously, relief evident on their faces as the group approached. "We heard gunfire," Kimmy said as they dismounted. "What happened?" Takala quickly explained the ambush and their intervention while Kimmy checked them for injuries. Morgan listened intently, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "An ambush suggests Randall knows you're coming," he observed. "He's desperate to prevent you from reaching Tucson before the hearing. All the more reason to get there as quickly as possible," Nahilze insisted. "We leave at first light." As the camp settled for what remained of the night, Jackson found himself unable to sleep despite his exhaustion. The events of the past days swirled in his mind, the sacred spring, Morgan's miraculous healing, the ambush, and now their race to Tucson. And beneath it all, the words that had haunted him since his dream of Chief Maka water will wash away your sins. He took out his pocket watch, opening it to gaze at Elizabeth's face in the moonlight. "I'm trying," he whispered to her memory. "I don't know if it's enough, but I'm trying." For the first time since her death, he could imagine her response without the accompanying wave of guilt and grief. She would have understood his journey, he thought. Elizabeth had always believed in redemption, in the possibility of becoming better than one's past mistakes. As he finally drifted towards sleep, Jackson felt a sense of purpose solidifying within him. Tomorrow they would ride for Tucson, facing whatever awaited them there. Whether they succeeded or failed, he was committed to this path now, not just for the Apache sisters who had shown him a different way to view his past, but for himself as well. The water had judged him. Now it remained to be seen whether the law and his own conscience would do the same.